You packed enough socks? That was the question that started the most expensive morning in Skybridge Airlines history. Not a boardroom ultimatum, not a legal filing, not a threatening letter from a team of lawyers in expensive suits, but a mother on a hospital break asking her son about his laundry situation before a long flight. Elijah Okafor laughed, and it was the first genuine sound he'd made since his alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., which was technically unnecessary, because he'd been awake since 5:30, lying on his back in the dark of his Atlanta apartment, running through the Zurich presentation in his head the way other people counted sheep. The apartment was small by the standards of what he could afford, but Elijah had never been particularly interested in what he could afford as a measure of what he needed. And what he needed was a kitchen counter with good light, a desk that faced a window and enough quiet that he could think without interference. He had all three. At all. He considered himself well housed. He stood at the counter in a faded navy hoodie that had been washed so many times the hood sat slightly lopsided. Eating cereal from a bowl he'd owned since college, watching the Atlanta sky outside his window go from black to the particular shade of deep blue that comes maybe 30 minutes before the sun fully commits to the day. On the counter beside his bowl, a single printed itinerary edges crisp because he'd printed it fresh the night before, even though he had it memorized. Zurich Global FinTech Summit. 3 days. 1 keynote presentation. Several meetings that would reshape the infrastructure of international banking for the next decade, though the invitation described them more modestly as round-table discussions. His mother had called at 6:02 right on schedule because Claudette Okafor worked the early nursing shift at Baltimore's Sinai Hospital, and her breaks came at predictable intervals, and she had called her son before every flight he'd ever taken since the first one, which was a school trip to Washington, D.C., when he was 11, and she had not yet found a reason to stop. She asked about the socks. She asked whether he'd eaten something real, and he told her about the cereal which she evaluated with the specific silence of a woman who knew her son could afford a private chef and chose Cheerios instead. She asked if the people in Zurich were good people, which was her way of asking whether they would treat him with the respect she believed he deserved, which was considerable. He told her they were fine, which was his way of saying he'd manage either way. She told him she loved him, and to text her when he landed, and then her break was over, and she was gone, and the apartment was quiet again except for the sound of him rinsing his bowl in the sink. He'd grown up in that Baltimore apartment she still lived in, the one whose mortgage note he'd paid off 2 years ago, slipping the paperwork under her door on a Sunday morning with a note that said only, "No more rent. Mom," and then sitting on the front stoop waiting for her to find it. She had opened the door and looked at him for a long time without speaking, and then she'd said, "Baby, what did you do?" in a voice that contained every variation of emotion a human being is capable of experiencing simultaneously. He'd told her he'd been working on a project. She'd framed the mortgage release document and hung it in the kitchen, which meant Elijah saw it every time he called her on video, which was probably her intention. She still called it working in computers. He had never corrected her. There was something he valued in the description, its simplicity, its accuracy in the broadest sense, and most of all, its complete indifference to the scale of what he'd built. Claudette Okafor loved her son with the specific depth of a woman who had raised him alone on a nurse's salary and watched him spend his teenage years in a public library instead of on a corner, and the financial specifics were secondary to the fact that he called regularly and ate enough and packed sufficient socks for his trip. He picked up his bag from beside the door, a battered leather messenger bag, brown going to tan at the corners, the shoulder strap repaired at one point with a length of black electrical tape that had since become a permanent feature, and slung it over his shoulder. The bag contained a laptop that had access to financial infrastructure. Most governments couldn't touch a notebook with 7 pages of Zurich presentation notes, a phone charger, and a paperback novel he was 2/3 through. He traveled light. He had found over years of moving through the world in a hoodie with an unremarkable bag that people made assumptions about what he was carrying and what he was worth and where he belonged, and he had learned to treat those assumptions as data rather than injury. He paused at the door, a habit he'd developed without meaning to a 1-second pause before stepping out into whatever the day had decided to be. He looked back at the apartment, the good light on the counter, the bowl drying in the rack, the window where in an hour the full Atlanta sun would come through at the exact angle he liked. He took a breath. He stepped outside. The rideshare to Hartsfield-Jackson took 23 minutes in the early morning light, which was fast enough that Elijah didn't bother opening the novel and instead opened his laptop, propping it on his knee in the way that made the driver glance in the rearview mirror with mild curiosity before returning his eyes to the road. On the screen, a live feed of the Singapore Exchange, which had closed 4 hours ago, but whose movements were still rippling through the Asian markets in the specific way that told Elijah something interesting was happening with tech liquidity in the region. Interesting enough to note, not interesting enough to act on before he'd had a second cup of coffee and reviewed the full picture from Zurich. He made a small notation in the margin of his notebook, closed the market feed, and opened instead the administrative dashboard for Veritas. Most people who had heard the name Veritas, and there were very few people outside the highest corridors of global finance who had heard it at all, understood it as a banking security protocol which was accurate. The way describing the Internet as a system for sending messages is accurate technically, true, operationally insufficient, and missing everything that made it matter. Veritas was a liquidity verification and behavioral risk detection platform that Elijah had designed at 21, working in a one-bedroom apartment in Baltimore with 2 monitors and a whiteboard he'd bought secondhand from an office that was closing. It was now embedded in the operational backbone of 4 of the world's 6 largest banking consortiums, processing approximately $340 billion in transactions every 72 hours. And detecting fraud, manipulation, and institutional risk with a precision that had made it quietly and without ceremony indispensable. The banks didn't advertise their dependence on it. They preferred the world to understand their security as the product of their own sophistication, rather than a 24-year-old's algorithm running in a server farm in Virginia. Elijah had no objection to this arrangement. Invisibility suited him. But Veritas had not started as a product. It had started as an active witness. Elijah was 19 in the middle of a summer internship at a regional bank in Baltimore, when he sat across a conference room table and watched a loan officer decline a mortgage application from a black family. A school teacher and a postal worker, impeccable credit, stable income, full documentation using language so carefully neutral it left no fingerprints. He watched the officer's eyes move between the couple and the paperwork, with a particular quality of assessment that was not about the numbers, and he watched the family leave with their folder and their polite thank yous, and he went back to his workstation and he looked at the data. What he found in the data was not a policy. It was a pattern, a dispersed multivariable pattern of differential outcomes that lived in the aggregate and was invisible in any individual decision. The numbers told a story the words were hiding, and the story was not about creditworthiness. He spent 6 months building a model that could detect those patterns in institutional decision-making and flag them as what they actually were: financial risk indicators. Because institutions that operated on those patterns made worse long-term decisions, generated higher default rates through market segmentation, and carried a reputational liability that in the age of social media had a quantifiable dollar value. Discrimination, Elijah had concluded, was not just a moral failure, it was a structural inefficiency, and his algorithm hated inefficiency. That model became Veritas, and buried in every Veritas licensing agreement in paragraph 7 of the operational governance section, which every bank's legal team had reviewed and signed, and then in the way of all fine print forgotten, was a clause that had never been invoked in 3 years of operation. The Architect Clause. In the event that a licensed entity demonstrates behavioral patterns consistent with discriminatory or ethically destabilizing conduct. The system's creator retains the unilateral right to initiate a Protocol 0 review, during which all liquidity pools and pending asset transfers associated with that entity are suspended pending behavioral risk assessment. Nobody had ever triggered it. Not because the clause was toothless, but because Elijah had never had sufficient cause, or rather because the incidents that might have warranted it had always resolved before reaching the threshold. He had a high threshold. He was not impulsive by nature. He dealt in patterns, not moments. He closed the Veritas dashboard and looked out the window of the rideshare at Atlanta spreading out in the morning light, the city just beginning to move delivery trucks and early commuters, and the particular kind of person who goes running before 6 a.m. because they have decided suffering before sunrise is a personality trait. His flight was Skybridge Airlines Flight 1140 Atlanta to JFK, with a connection to Zurich and then ground transport to the conference hotel. He had booked it 6 weeks in advance. He always booked seat 1A not because he cared about status or needed the legroom or felt entitled to the front of the cabin, but because the window seat on the left side of a northbound flight in morning hours caught the light at an angle that suited him, and he did his best thinking in that particular quality of light, and he had a lot of thinking to do between Atlanta and JFK. He had once, on a flight from Chicago to New York, spent the entire journey seated 2 rows behind the CFO of one of the banks that licensed Veritas. The CFO had spent 40 minutes complaining to his seatmate about the Veritas algorithm's creator being essentially unreachable and frankly arrogant about it. Elijah had listened with one earbud out and had thought the assessment was partially fair. At baggage claim, the CFO had held the door for him without recognition, and Elijah had said thank you, and they had parted ways in the taxi line like strangers, which was exactly what they were. He preferred it that way. The invisibility was information. People behaved according to what they believed they were being watched by, and Elijah, who was almost never recognized and was almost always underestimated, had learned more about the world from his position of apparent irrelevance than he could have from any position of obvious power. The rideshare pulled up to the terminal. Elijah closed his laptop, zipped his bag, and got out. Hartsfield-Jackson at 8:15 in the morning was the particular kind of organized chaos that only major airports achieve, thousands of people moving with the focused urgency of people who have somewhere to be, and the specific terror of people who are not certain they will get there. All of it contained within a structure of glass and moving walkways, and the constant low roar of announcement systems speaking to everyone and no one simultaneously. Elijah moved through it the way he moved through most things, without urgency but without hesitation, his battered bag over one shoulder, his headphones around his neck, not on his ears, because he liked to hear the ambient sound of places he passed through, and his phone in his jacket pocket, already switched to airplane mode as a habit he'd developed to avoid the specific psychological tax of being reachable in airports. Terminal F Gate 34. He knew the walk. Security had taken 4 minutes because he'd packed correctly and moved efficiently, and the TSA agent had given him the brief neutral nod of someone doing their job in the absence of any complication. He'd bought a coffee from a stand near the gate, regular drip. Nothing fancy, in a paper cup that was too hot to hold for the first few minutes, and arrived at the boarding area with 20 minutes to spare, which was sufficient. The priority boarding lane was empty. He stepped into it. "Sir," a gate agent appeared at his elbow. Young, probably her first year with the lanyard of a recent hire, and the expression of someone who had been told to be vigilant without being told precisely what to be vigilant about. She looked at his hoodie. She looked at his bag. She looked at his sneakers, which were limited edition and scuffed in the specific way that comes from actually wearing things rather than collecting them. And she looked at the boarding pass on his phone screen, and then she looked back at him, and in the space between looking at the boarding pass and looking back at him, something happened in her face that was not quite a decision but was not quite neutral either. "This lane is for first class and Skybridge elite members." "I know," Elijah said. His voice was soft, the kind of voice that doesn't perform patience but simply has it. "I'm in 1A. She took his phone, carefully held it to the scanner. The machine beeped, confirmation, clean. No flags, seat 1. A paid verified. And she looked at the screen, and then she looked at him again with the expression of someone whose internal model of the world has generated a result that doesn't match the data and hasn't yet decided which to trust. She gave him his phone back. She let him through. But she watched him walk toward the jet bridge with the sustained attention of someone who has decided the system must be wrong, that something has slipped through that shouldn't have, that she will think about this later. Elijah did not look back. He walked down the jet bridge into the cool, recycled air tunnel that connected the terminal to the aircraft, and he stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight 114. Oh, it was the particular hush of a well-appointed aircraft before the majority of passengers have boarded, soft lighting, the low murmur of the ventilation system, the smell of cleaned upholstery, and the faint trace of a cleaning product that tried to smell like nothing. 2 flight attendants moved in the forward galley with the choreographed efficiency of people who do this dozens of times a week. A passenger in 3B was already asleep, which seemed optimistic for 8:20 in the morning, but was not Elijah's concern. Seat 1A was by the window as booked as expected as needed. He lifted his bag into the overhead bin because he knew the protocol, because he had read the policy, because he had been doing this since he was 20, and he knew precisely where his bag was supposed to go, and had never once needed to be told. And he settled into the seat and pulled out his tablet and opened the Singapore market data he'd been tracking in the car. The cabin filled gradually around him. A woman in her 60s in 2B, silver-haired and carrying a canvas tote with the logo of a university press, who gave him a brief, warm nod that he returned. A man in 2C, 30s, consultant by posture, who was already on his phone with the urgent energy of someone managing a situation from a distance. A few rows back, an older black woman settled into 3F with the deliberate care of someone who has learned over many decades to take up space precisely and completely. She adjusted her reading glasses, opened a novel, and became immediately absorbed. Elijah watched the market data. The Singapore ripple was resolving in the direction he'd suspected. He made another notation. He was thinking about the Zurich presentation, specifically the second section, the behavioral risk expansion module, which he'd reworked 3 times in the past week and still felt slightly front-heavy when the voice arrived. It arrived from the aisle. It arrived with the particular tone of a man who has never in his adult life addressed a problem directly, only directed others to address it for him. "There's someone in my seat." Bradford Whitmore had been a man of consequence for long enough that he had largely stopped distinguishing between the world accommodating him and the world simply being arranged correctly. At 63, he carried himself with the settled authority of someone who had not been told no in so many years that the concept had become theoretical, something that happened to other people in situations he read about with mild interest, before returning to matters that affected him directly. He was broad through the shoulders in a way that had once been athletic and was now simply large. His silver-white hair parted with the precision of a man whose barber came to him, rather than the reverse. His navy blazer bearing brass buttons that caught the cabin light, with the subtle gleam of something expensive, choosing not to announce itself too loudly, while announcing itself constantly. His face carried the permanent flush of a man who has eaten and drunk well for decades, and his hands, currently gripping the back of the seat in front of Elijah's row, as he surveyed the situation, were the hands of someone accustomed to holding things. Bradford Whitmore was the chairman of Whitmore Capital Group, which held significant stakes in 17 companies across infrastructure, hospitality, and aviation, including a large enough position in Skybridge Airlines that his relationship with the company's senior leadership could reasonably be described as that of a man who owned a meaningful percentage of the building, talking to the people who ran it on his behalf. He flew Skybridge approximately 40 times per year. He had a preferred seat. He had a preferred temperature in the cabin. He had a preferred champagne, and Cassandra knew it, which was one of the reasons Cassandra was already at his elbow. Cassandra Vane had been the lead flight attendant on Skybridge's premium routes for 9 years, and in those 9 years, she had developed the specific skill set of a person whose entire professional identity is organized around the preferences of a certain category of passenger. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled into a perfect chignon. Her smile was the smile of someone who had practiced it in mirrors until it became reflexive, present on her face at all times, reaching her eyes approximately 40% of the time, and most reliably present when she was looking at Bradford Whitmore. She had been present at the forward galley when Bradford boarded, and she had seen immediately from his expression that something was wrong, and she had moved to his side with the trained urgency of someone whose job is to make things right before they become problems. Bradford did not speak to Elijah. This was the first and most telling thing about the next 3 minutes throughout the entirety of what followed. Bradford Whitmore addressed not a single word directly to the young man sitting in the seat he had decided belonged to him. He spoke to Cassandra. He spoke about Elijah in Elijah's presence in the third person, the way one might speak about a piece of furniture that had been left in the wrong room. "Cassandra," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man speaking to someone whose job it is to handle exactly this. "Why is there someone in my seat?" Cassandra turned to Elijah, and her manner shifted with the seamless, well-practiced fluency of someone who has learned to perform concern while executing instruction. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying the specific warmth of a flight attendant addressing a passenger she has already assessed as a problem to be managed. "I think there may have been a mix-up. This is Mr. Bradford Whitmore. He is a Skybridge Chairman's Circle member, and his usual seat in 2A is unfortunately experiencing a technical difficulty with the recline mechanism." Elijah looked up from his tablet. He looked at Cassandra. He looked at Bradford. He looked at his boarding pass. "I have seat 1A, he said. His voice carrying the same unhurried steadiness it always carried, the voice of a man who has learned that even tones are more powerful than raised ones. "I booked it 6 weeks ago." Cassandra's smile held. "Of course. And we completely understand. We'd like to offer you a lovely alternative. We have a wonderful seat in row 14 extra legroom, and we'd be happy to provide a voucher for your inconvenience." Row 14 was in economy. The math was not subtle. They were asking him to trade a $12,000 pod with a lie-flat bed and a window for an Economy Plus seat near the emergency exit, so that a man who had not purchased seat 1A could sit in seat 1A because that man was the kind of man that airlines accommodated, and Elijah, in Cassandra's evident assessment, was not. Elijah set his tablet down in his lap. "No," he said. The silence that followed that single word had a texture to it, something that hadn't been in the cabin air before, something that a few of the passengers nearby registered as a change in atmospheric pressure, even if they couldn't have named what had shifted. The man in 2C lowered his phone by an inch. The woman in 2B turned a page of her tote bag novel without reading it. In 3F, the older woman in the reading glasses went still, her eyes remaining on the page while her attention moved elsewhere entirely. Bradford Whitmore's face, which had carried the expression of a man waiting for a minor inconvenience to be resolved, moved through a rapid sequence of emotions. Irritation, then a more active anger, and then something underneath both of those that was older and more ingrained and harder to name directly. He drew himself up in the aisle. "Do you know who I am?" His voice was not loud, but it had the particular carrying quality of a voice that has spent decades in rooms where what it said mattered. "I run Whitmore Capital. I have been flying this airline for 15 years. I have a relationship with this airline that goes considerably beyond a ticket purchase." Elijah looked at him with the steady patience of someone who has heard variations of this particular speech many times before in many rooms in many configurations and has concluded that the speech itself is data. "I have a boarding pass," he said, "for seat 1A. I paid full fare. I'm not causing a disturbance." He paused. "If there's an issue with the seat in 2A, the airline should find Mr. Whitmore an equivalent seat elsewhere in the cabin." Cassandra's customer service face had begun to slip at the edges the way professional composure does when the person wearing it decides the situation no longer warrants the effort. She stepped closer. "I am giving you a direct instruction as a senior crew member," she said, and her voice had dropped the warmth entirely now, leaving only the steel that had been underneath it the whole time. "Vacate this seat." "On what grounds?" Elijah asked. Cassandra opened her mouth, closed it. The grounds were not enumerable in language that would survive any form of scrutiny, and something in the architecture of her expression acknowledged this without admitting it. And then Bradford Whitmore, who had turned to Cassandra with the expression of a man communicating with a subordinate, said the thing that made it real, the thing that had been present in every moment of the preceding exchange, but that he now said out loud in a voice pitched at Cassandra, but carrying cleanly to the 4 rows around them. "He doesn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger." The cabin went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. The woman in 2B stopped pretending to read. The man in 2C put his phone entirely in his lap. In 3F, Miriam retired principal on her way to see her granddaughter, a woman who had spent 40 years recognizing the specific shape of this particular moment, felt something land in her chest like a stone, dropping into still water, and she looked up from her novel and watched. Elijah sat with those words for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood. He was taller than Bradford had apparently accounted for because Bradford took a half step back without seeming to notice he'd done it. Elijah did not move toward him. He simply stood at his full height, and for a moment the geometry of the aisle was different than it had been. He reached up, opened the overhead bin, and retrieved his bag. Cassandra said, "We're reaccommodating you." Her voice had recovered its professional smoothness, the word reaccommodating doing the specific work of language that wishes to describe a removal as a service. Elijah looked at Bradford once, a brief, direct, entirely level look, the kind that carries no performance of emotion, because no performance is required when the reality is sufficient. Bradford looked at the seat back. He did not look at Elijah. Elijah walked up the jet bridge. Behind him, the cabin moved slowly back toward its normal rhythms. The ventilation hum, the rustle of magazines, the sound of a champagne flute being placed on a side table. Bradford settled into 1A and said something to Cassandra in the low, satisfied tone of a problem resolved. In 3F, Miriam watched the empty jet bridge for a long moment after Elijah had gone. She did not return to her novel. She took off her glasses, folded them carefully, and held them in her hands and looked at the back of the seat in front of her. The man in 2C looked at his drink. He didn't go to the gate desk. He didn't ask for a supervisor. He didn't stand in the boarding area waiting for someone to come find him and apologize and make it right in the small transactional way that airports make things right when they want a situation to stop being a situation without actually addressing the situation. Elijah Okafor had spent enough years moving through the world in a faded hoodie with an unremarkable bag to know exactly what that particular offer of resolution would look and feel like, and he was not interested in it. He walked back into Terminal F and found a seat near a large window on the east-facing wall where the morning light came through at a low angle and painted a wide stripe of gold across the floor. He sat down on his bag, not on the airport chair beside it on the bag itself, the battered leather warm under him, and he put his elbows on his knees, and he looked out the window at the tarmac. Flight 1140 was visible from where he sat, a Skybridge 737 in the airline's gray and blue livery, the ground crew moving around it with the practiced efficiency of people who do this 40 times a day, a fuel truck pulling slowly away from the wing. As he watched the jet bridge retracted from the aircraft door. The door sealed. The plane began the slow, patient process of becoming something in the air rather than something on the ground. Bradford Whitmore was in seat 1A now. The champagne would have arrived by the time the plane finished taxiing. There would be warm nuts and a blanket and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had wanted a thing and had gotten it because he was the kind of man who got things, and the only evidence that anything unusual had occurred would be the faint discomfort in the minds of the passengers who had watched and said nothing, which would dissolve long before they reached their destinations. Elijah watched the plane. He thought about his mother's kitchen where the framed mortgage release hung on the wall next to a school photo of him at 12 in a too big blazer. He thought about the third-floor reading room of the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore, where he had spent 3 winters teaching himself cryptography and distributed systems from books he could borrow but not afford to buy, returning each one when he'd memorized what he needed, checking out the next. He thought about a loan officer and a school teacher and a postal worker and a folder of paperwork that didn't get what it deserved. He thought about the woman in 3F who had watched him leave. He hadn't seen her face clearly, but he had seen the way she went still, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has recognized something they have seen before and did not want to see again. He opened his laptop. The screen filled with the Veritas administrative dashboard, clean, green lit, organized the way Elijah organized everything, which was to say completely and without sentiment. He navigated to the Protocol 0 initiation interface. He had visited this page before, over the years, had looked at it the way one looks at a fire extinguisher present, necessary, useful in a specific category of emergency, and not to be deployed casually. He looked at the field where an entity name would be entered. He looked at the terminal outside. He looked at Flight 1140, which was now beginning to move slowly along the taxiway, small and ordinary-looking in the distance. He looked back at the screen. He closed the laptop. He wasn't ready yet. He sat with the weight of what he was considering, and he held it the way his mother had taught him to hold things that mattered carefully with both hands without rushing. He would know when it was time. He watched the plane until it turned the corner of the taxiway and disappeared from view. Then he opened the laptop again. He dialed the Veritas operations line from memory, a 12-digit number that routed through 3 servers before connecting to the system's administrative core. A number that existed on no website, no business card, no document that had ever been filed with a regulatory body. The line rang once. A voice answered, automated, neutral, calibrated specifically to project the impression of competence without personality. Veritas operations. Biometric verification required. Please speak your passphrase. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Around him, Terminal F continued its morning rhythms, rolling luggage and coffee cups and the compressed, anxious energy of people who are either late or afraid they will be. A child somewhere to his left was explaining to a parent with considerable patience that the plane they were looking at was a different kind from the one in a book she had. Nobody was looking at him. Nobody ever looked at him in airports, which remained one of his favorite things about airports. Okafor, he said, his voice low and level the way he said everything. Authorization level architect. Passphrase Meridian Falls at 0. Biometric confirmed. Welcome, Mr. Okafor. What do you need? He had drafted what he was going to say while he was sitting on his bag, looking at the tarmac. Not the words exactly, because the system understood functional commands, rather than conversational language, but the shape of it. The boundary of it, the weight of what it meant. He had held it carefully with both hands, the way his mother taught him, and he had decided. Initiate protocol. 0 review, he said. Target entity, Skybridge, Global Holdings, Merchant ID. SB 7741 Global. Full liquidity suspension. All pending asset transfers to be held pending behavioral risk assessment. Effective immediately. Authorization Okafor Alpha 7. There was a pause, 3 seconds, which was the system's verification interval long enough for the protocol to cross-reference his biometrics against the licensing database, confirm his identity against the architect clause embedded in Skybridge's Veritas contract, and assess whether the command parameters fell within the scope of his authority. They did. They always would. He had written the parameters himself. Understood, the voice said. Protocol 0 review initiated against Skybridge Global Holdings. Confirmation: all liquidity pools associated with merchant ID SB 7741 Global are now suspended. All pending asset transfers, including escrow positions, are flagged for hold pending behavioral risk review completion. Estimated system propagation, 11 to 14 minutes. Do you wish to set a review expiration window? No expiration, Elijah said. Manual release only. Confirmed. Manual release only. Architect authorization required for reinstatement. Anything else, no? Have a good morning, Mr. Okafor. He ended the call. He sat with his phone in his hand for a moment, looking at the screen. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket and stood up and walked to the coffee kiosk 20 feet away and ordered a regular drip coffee in the largest size they had, because it was going to be a long morning, and he'd already decided to be entirely present for it rather than medicated against it by efficiency. The woman at the kiosk charged him $4.30. He thanked her. He carried the cup back to his window seat and sat back down. The coffee was too hot to drink for the first few minutes, which he'd expected, so he held it in both hands and let the warmth travel through his palms and looked out at the tarmac where Flight 140 was no longer visible. It had taxied to the runway and was somewhere in the queue. Now Bradford settling deeper into the lie-flat pod. Cassandra presenting the amuse-bouche or whatever it was that first class received at 8:30 in the morning. The whole machinery of premium hospitality turning smoothly for people it had decided deserved it. In 11 to 14 minutes, a rather different machinery would begin to turn. Elijah took a careful sip of coffee. It was still slightly too hot, but drinkable, which was sufficient. He opened his laptop and went back to the Singapore market data, because the morning wasn't going to stop being interesting just because he'd introduced a significant variable into the Skybridge Holdings operational picture. And he preferred to keep working when he had something to think about. And he always had something to think about, which was one of the reasons he was difficult to reach by people who wanted his attention on their timeline rather than his. He thought about the Zurich presentation. He'd need to rebook his connection. He'd need to let the conference coordinator know he'd be arriving a day late. He'd need to arrange alternate transportation from the private terminal, because his original connection was now obviously not happening. These were logistical considerations that required attention. He pulled up his email and began composing a message to his Zurich contact. Unavoidable delay. Arriving tomorrow. Will need the morning session rescheduled. He paused over the second sentence. Added, apologies for the inconvenience. I'll explain when I arrive. He sent it. He drank his coffee. He waited. The first alert came at 9:04 a.m. on the operations dashboard of Skybridge Airlines' IT floor in Midtown Manhattan, and Terry Bassett, the morning shift supervisor, noticed it the way you notice a single drop of water on a dry sidewalk present slightly anomalous. Probably nothing. He flagged it to the junior tech at the next station and went back to his coffee. The second alert came 40 seconds later. Then the third. Then, in a cascade that Terry would later describe to investigators as like watching a circuit board fry in real time, but extremely slowly. And then all at once the entire dashboard began to light up in the specific red that the system reserved for critical failures, and the junior tech stopped typing and said Terry, in the particular tone of voice that people use when they want to communicate urgency without triggering the kind of panic that makes urgencies worse. Credit card transactions were declining. Not one terminal, not one region, all of them. The payment gateway serving Skybridge's ticket counters in London had rejected 17 consecutive transactions. Singapore was offline. Atlanta. Detroit, Dallas. The declines were propagating across Skybridge's entire processing network in a pattern that was not consistent with a server failure or a provider outage, because the provider was confirmed up. The servers were confirmed running and the network showed full connectivity. The system was working. It simply wasn't working for Skybridge. Terry called his manager. His manager called the IT director. The IT director called the CFO. Linda Mercer was in a conference room on the 31st floor running the final pre-announcement review for the acquisition that her team had spent 8 months structuring the purchase of Meridian Regional Air, a southeastern carrier with 27 routes and a route map that slotted into Skybridge's existing network with the satisfying precision of a well-cut piece of a jigsaw puzzle. The deal was worth $1.7 billion. The transfer was scheduled for 4 p.m. that afternoon. The press conference was booked. The acquisition target's CEO was already in the building. Her phone rang. She looked at the caller ID registered that it was the IT director calling her directly, rather than going through normal channels, and excused herself from the room. What the IT director told her in the next 90 seconds turned her still in the particular way that highly competent people go still when they receive information that is simultaneously clear and catastrophic. Not frozen, not panicked, but absolutely motionless, while every cognitive resource redirects toward the problem. The payment authorization bridge was rejecting Skybridge's merchant ID, not due to a technical failure, due to a deliberate flag. The Veritas system. The liquidity verification platform embedded in Skybridge's banking consortium agreements had placed a Protocol 0 hold on all Skybridge assets. This was not a glitch. This was not a hack. This was an authorized action taken under the terms of Skybridge's own licensing agreement with the Veritas network. The escrow account holding the $1.7 billion acquisition transfer was frozen. Linda asked who had triggered the hold. The IT director told her. She asked him to repeat it. He did. Linda Mercer had heard the name Elijah Okafor exactly once before in a risk briefing document she'd received 8 months ago when the Veritas licensing renewal had come across her desk, a briefing that had described the architect clause in language that she'd registered as boilerplate and filed accordingly because no one had ever triggered the architect clause and she had apparently concluded that no one ever would. She pulled up everything on Elijah Okafor in the next 4 minutes, using the executive database access she had for due diligence purposes, and she read what she found with the focused attention of someone who is in the process of understanding exactly how severely a situation has been misunderstood. She read about Veritas. She read about the architect clause. She read about the system's penetration into 4 of the 6 largest banking consortiums. She read the clause itself, which she had last seen in a document she had signed on behalf of the company without reading paragraph 7. Then she walked across the floor to the elevator, rode it up 11 floors, walked past the CEO's assistant without stopping, and opened Richard Harlan's office door. Richard was at his desk reviewing talking points for the press conference. The announcement of the Meridian acquisition, the capstone of a career that he had been quietly planning to conclude on this particular high note, the retirement announcement drafted and dated and sitting in the top right drawer of his desk waiting for the right moment. He looked up at Linda's face and put the talking points down. "The escrow is frozen," Linda said. "We have until 4 o'clock before the deal expires and penalty clauses trigger. If we hit the penalty clauses, we lose $340 million in breakage fees alone, and Meridian walks." Richard stared at her. "Why is it frozen, Veritas?" "The architect triggered a Protocol 0 review against us." "Who authorized?" he began, and then stopped because the look on Linda's face told him that the question he was about to ask was the wrong one, and that the right question was different. Why, he asked instead. Linda told him. Briefly, 4 sentences. Richard Harlan sat very still. Then he asked, "Where is he now?" "His phone is still pinging from Terminal F at Hartsfield-Jackson," Linda said. "He hasn't left the airport." Richard looked at the talking points on his desk. He looked at the retirement announcement in the drawer. He picked up his phone. "Get me Cassandra Vane," he said. "Get me Bradford Whitmore. and get someone to find out what time the next flight to Atlanta is. Richard Harlan had built Skybridge from a regional carrier with 12 routes and a reputation for lost luggage into the fourth largest airline in North America. And he had done it through a combination of operational discipline, strategic acquisition, and the particular kind of relentless forward motion that people who have never stopped moving tend to mistake for courage when it is actually closer to velocity. The understanding that if you slow down long enough to examine the ground beneath your feet, you might discover it is less solid than your momentum has assumed. He was 58 years old. He was 2 years, maybe 3, from the kind of exit he'd envisioned since his 40s. A planned transition, a negotiated succession, a final acquisition that would cement Skybridge's position as the dominant carrier in the southeastern corridor and leave his name on something permanent. The Meridian deal was that acquisition. He had spent 8 months and the full strategic resources of his executive team on it. The press conference was in 4 hours. The acquisition target's CEO was in the building in the conference room on the 22nd floor with his lawyers and his advisors, and the specific, barely contained excitement of a man who was about to sell his company for considerably more than he'd expected to get. The $1.7 billion was supposed to move at 4 p.m. It was now 9:22 a.m. He had 6 hours and 38 minutes. Except that the money was frozen. Richard was not a man given to panic. Panic was the response of people who hadn't anticipated contingencies, and Richard prided himself on having anticipated most contingencies. But this was not a contingency he had anticipated, because the contingency required the simultaneous occurrence of 3 events he had each individually assessed as unlikely a passenger removal incident in the first-class cabin of a domestic flight. That passenger being the creator of the banking protocol their entire financial infrastructure depended on, and that creator having both the means and the motivation to do what he had apparently done. 3 individually unlikely things had happened on the same Tuesday morning, and the result was sitting in his escrow account, not moving. He got Cassandra Vane on a satellite call from the cockpit of Flight 114 at 9:41 a.m. 40 minutes into the flight, while Captain Mills stood to one side of the cockpit with the expression of a man who has been told that the routine Tuesday flight he is flying has become, in some sense he does not yet fully understand, historic. Cassandra's voice, when she answered, was cheerful, which was the voice of someone who believed she had handled a situation correctly and was available to confirm this, if asked. Richard did not ask. He told her in the flat, precise language he used when what he was saying was too serious for tone. What had happened to the company's assets in the 73 minutes since she had told a man he didn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger and removed him from seat 1A. The cheerfulness left her voice. Richard told her who Elijah Okafor was. He gave her the short version. Veritas the architect clause, the $1.7 billion deadline, because the short version was sufficient to communicate what needed to be communicated, which was that the decision she had made at 8:35 a.m., based on a man's hoodie and age and the color of his skin, had generated consequences that were currently printing themselves in red across every financial dashboard the company owned. Cassandra said, "I didn't know who he was." Richard said, "I understand that. I need you to call him. The call will patch through from the aircraft line. You will apologize. You will tell him that I am coming to Atlanta to meet with him personally. And you will ask him, not demand, not negotiate. Ask him what he needs from us to begin a conversation." "What if he doesn't answer?" "Then you will call again," Richard said. "And again. You will keep calling until he answers. Because if that money doesn't move by 4 o'clock, 4,000 Skybridge employees start their Wednesday morning differently than they started this one. And that is the consequence of what happened in seat 1A. He ended the call. He stood for a moment in his office, the talking points still on the desk, the retirement announcement in the drawer, and he did something he almost never did, which was nothing. He stood and he breathed and he let the full weight of the morning land on him without deflecting any of it, because he had learned long ago that the things you deflect have a way of collecting interest. Then he walked to his closet, took out a jacket, and picked up his phone. "Linda," he said when she answered. "What's the fastest way to get from Midtown Manhattan to Hartsfield-Jackson Terminal F?" Linda told him. "Corporate jet from Teterboro, approximately 90 minutes in the air, ground transport to the terminal." "Book it," Richard said. "I'm leaving in 20 minutes." He looked at his watch. 9:47 a.m. If everything moved efficiently, he could be in Terminal F by noon. He had until 4 o'clock. He had if Cassandra reached Elijah and the conversation went as he hoped slightly more runway than he feared. He picked up his jacket. He looked once more at the retirement announcement in the drawer. He left it there. The first-class cabin of Flight 114 had settled into its cruising altitude rhythm by the time Captain Mills called Cassandra to the cockpit, the particular hush of a pressurized tube moving through the upper atmosphere. Passengers reclined or reading or wearing the slightly glazed expression of people who have accepted that they are temporarily outside the jurisdiction of their own lives. Bradford Whitmore was in seat 1. A linen napkin tucked into his collar, the remains of a warm nut service on his tray, explaining to Cassandra's colleague, a younger flight attendant named Priya, who had not yet developed the protective emotional scar tissue that comes from years of premium service, that the real problem with modern aviation was that standards had become entirely too flexible, which was a statement that landed differently in the galley after Mills's announcement than it would have otherwise. Cassandra had told the story twice already. The first time in the forward galley to Priya with the satisfied efficiency of someone debriefing an operation that went according to plan. The second time less fully in the tonal shorthand of colleagues who understand each other's assumptions to the other crew member working the forward section. Both times she had framed it as a routine customer management decision, a disruptive passenger, a senior crew, call a protocol followed. She had not said the words "he doesn't fit the profile" aloud because those were Bradford's words and not hers, though she understood standing in the galley at 30,000 feet that the action she had taken was a direct and functional endorsement of them. Mills opened the cockpit door and looked at her. "Cassandra. CEO on the satellite line. Priority 1. She straightened up. Priority 1 calls were rare enough that her first response was the specific alertness of someone expecting commendation or crisis and not yet knowing which. She had, until approximately 40 seconds ago, believed it was the former. She stepped into the cockpit. Mills handed her the headset. She put it on. "This is Cassandra Vane," she said. "Cassandra." Richard Harlan's voice was a voice she had heard at company events and training videos, and one all-hands call during a labor dispute 3 years ago. She recognized it immediately, and what she recognized in it now was not the measured authority of those previous encounters, but something stripped of management, something raw and immediate in the way that voices get when the stakes are not being managed for an audience. "I need you to confirm what happened with the passenger in seat 1A this morning." She confirmed it. She used the same framing she'd used in the galley routine decision protocol compliance disruptive passenger. As she spoke, she was aware that the framing sounded different to her own ears this time, and she couldn't immediately identify why until she registered that Richard had not responded to any of it with the neutral acknowledgement that indicated she was being heard as she intended. When she finished, there was a silence on the line. Then Richard told her who Elijah Okafor was. She listened. She stood in the cockpit of a plane at 31,000 feet, and she listened to the CEO of the company she had worked for 9 years explain in 4 measured sentences that the man whose hoodie she had assessed and whose presence in seat 1. She had determined to be the kind of mistake the airline was better off correcting. That man had suspended the financial operations of Skybridge Airlines approximately 11 minutes after she had watched him walk up the jet bridge. The headset felt very heavy. "I didn't know," she said. The words came out of her automatically, the first available response to information that was too large to process in real time. He didn't look. Richard stopped her. Not with volume, with quiet. The quiet of a man who was also in this moment recalibrating everything, and who did not have the space or the inclination to discuss what Elijah had looked like. There would be time for that later. There was not time for it now. He told her what he needed. She would call Elijah. She would use the aircraft satellite number. She would apologize, not the airline's apology, not the policy language, a human one, as clearly and directly as she could manage. She would tell him Richard was on his way to Atlanta. She would ask him without condition or leverage what a conversation would require. "And if he won't lift the freeze?" Cassandra asked. "That's not the question to ask him," Richard said. "That's the question you ask after you've apologized. The apology comes first. Not as a strategy." "Because it's right." The line clicked. Cassandra handed the headset back to Mills. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is grateful to be responsible only for the aircraft and not for whatever was happening on the other side of that call. She walked back through the galley toward the first-class cabin. Priya looked at her face and decided not to say anything. Bradford was still reclined, apparently napping now, the linen napkin still at his collar. Cassandra stood at the galley curtain for a moment. She thought about Elijah's face when he stood up, not angry, not performing dignity, simply having it in a way that required nothing from her or Bradford or anyone else in that cabin. She had looked at that face and made an assessment that she had dressed in the language of protocol and passenger management, and she had been wrong, and the wrongness was of a specific, uncomfortable kind, because it did not require Elijah to be the architect of anything. It had been wrong before she knew who he was, wrong in the ordinary morning light of an ordinary boarding process, wrong in a way that had nothing to do with Veritas or $1.7 billion or the satellite phone. She picked up the aircraft phone. She dialed. Cassandra went to Bradford first. Not because protocol required it, but because she needed him to understand what was happening before she placed the call to Elijah, and she needed to understand what she was dealing with, whether Bradford had the capacity to grasp the weight of the morning, or whether she would be managing two crises simultaneously while trying to navigate one. She approached his seat with the measured step of someone carrying information that she has not yet determined how to deliver. Bradford was, as she'd noted from the galley, somewhere between awake and asleep, the satisfied semi-consciousness of a man in a comfortable seat at altitude, one hand resting on the armrest, the other loosely holding a glass that had recently contained champagne and now contained only a half-inch of flat residue. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly enough not to disturb the nearby passengers. He opened one eye. The eye contained the mild, proprietary irritation of a man whose rest has been interrupted by a person whose job description includes not interrupting his rest. "What is it, Cassandra? Is it the meal service?" "No, sir." She crouched slightly, the professional positioning of someone delivering private information in a shared space, bringing herself to his level, keeping her voice below the ambient cabin hum. "I need to speak with you about the passenger from earlier, from seat 1A. Both eyes opened. The irritation sharpened. "I thought that was resolved." "It's become more complicated," she said. She told him as concisely and accurately as she could what Richard Harlan had told her. She told him about Veritas. She told him about the architect clause. She kept her voice level and her face composed because the first-class cabin of a commercial flight at cruising altitude was not the correct venue for any expression of the emotion she was currently experiencing, which was a complex and not entirely comfortable amalgam of professional alarm and something harder to categorize. Bradford Whitmore listened. She watched his face move through its responses, the initial skepticism of a man who defaults to doubting information that inconveniences him, then the reluctant engagement of someone who is recognizing that the information is not in fact deniable, and then a third thing that she had not anticipated, which was a genuine and unguarded stillness. He reached for his phone. It was a deliberate, slow movement, the way people move when they're doing something they're not sure they want to see the result of. He opened his private banking application. He pressed the Face ID. The dashboard loaded. The total balance field showed a number. The number was 0. Below it, security hold pending behavioral risk review. Bradford stared at the screen. He was a man who had held numbers in his head for 4 decades, compound interest rates, acquisition multiples, quarterly earnings variances, and the number currently on his screen was one he had not encountered in his adult life in a context that applied to his own account. 0. Not a glitch, not a display error, not a rounding issue. 0. He did not shout. For the first time in the 30 minutes since he had settled into seat 1A with the comfortable assurance of having won Bradford, Whitmore went entirely, completely quiet. His hand with the phone in it lowered to his lap. He looked at the seat back in front of him. Cassandra gave him 15 seconds. Then she said very carefully, "He wants to speak with you directly." Bradford looked at her. His face had lost the confident flush that was usually its resting state. He looked without it older than he had, and smaller and more accurately human. "Speak with me," he repeated. "Yes, sir. He wants you on the line. I'm going to call him now, and I need you to—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Listen to what he says, and say what Bradford asked." His voice had changed. It was not humble. Bradford Whitmore was not a man built for humility, and one morning of reckoning was not going to structurally rebuild him, but it was, for the first time, uncertain. The certainty had gone out of it, and what was left was an older man in a borrowed seat holding a phone that told him his balance was 0 at 30,000 feet, unable to move, unable to call his broker or his lawyers or any of the people whose jobs it was to stand between him and the direct consequences of his decisions. "Tell him you understand what you did," Cassandra said. She had not planned to say it that way. She had planned to frame it differently, more tactically, more managerially. But she was tired, and the morning had been long, and the words came out true. Bradford looked at her for a moment. "I'll speak to him," he said. His voice was flat and stripped, the voice of a man who has run out of performance. Cassandra straightened up. She looked at the seat he was sitting in, seat 1A, the window seat on the left side where the morning light would have come through at the angle Elijah had booked it for, the angle he had told no one about, the angle that was just his for his thinking on his morning. She thought about that for a single second. Then she walked to the forward galley and picked up the satellite phone. Elijah's phone rang at 10:14 a.m., and the number on the screen read, "Skybridge Airlines Flight 1140 Aircraft Line." He looked at it for 2 rings without picking up, not from hesitation, but from the specific satisfaction of someone watching a mechanism operate exactly as designed. On the 3rd ring, he answered. "This is Okafor. Mr. Okafor." Cassandra's voice was different from the voice that had told him he didn't fit the profile. That voice had carried professional warmth over structural indifference, the temperature of customer service without the substance. This voice was smaller, more direct, the way voices get when the audience has been reduced to 2 and the performance infrastructure has been removed. "This is Cassandra Vane. From the flight this morning." "I remember you," Elijah said. A pause. "I'm calling to—" She started, then stopped the way people stop when they realize the sentence they've begun will require them to mean what they say, and they haven't finished deciding if they do. She started again. "I made a decision this morning that I should not have made. I assessed you incorrectly." "Not incorrectly by policy," she said, and something in her voice tightened and then released incorrectly by the standard of treating a person like a person. That was wrong. "I'm sorry." Elijah was quiet for a moment. The apology was real enough, not fully formed, not entirely free of the instinct to frame personal accountability as policy failure, but real enough to be heard. He registered it. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. "Put him on." Another pause longer this time. He heard her move footsteps, the faint shift of cabin air, the whisper of the curtain between galley and cabin. Then a different quality of silence, a man's breathing. "This is Bradford Whitmore." The voice was not the voice from the aisle. It had lost the weight it used in rooms where weight was an asset. At 30,000 feet with zero in his account, Bradford Whitmore had a voice that was simply a man talking. "Mr. Whitmore," Elijah said. "How is the seat?" Bradford did not answer that. He said, "What do you want?" Elijah had spent the last hour and 40 minutes at his window seat in Terminal F, thinking about exactly this question, not the tactical answer, which was straightforward, but the honest answer, which required more precision. He had thought about what the morning represented, not just the incident on the plane, which was one morning in a life that had contained many such mornings, but what this particular morning had offered him, that most of those previous mornings had not, which was the means to do something with the pattern, rather than simply absorb it. "I don't want your money," Elijah said. "You were already going to try that, so I'm taking it off the table." He paused. "I want Richard Harlan to come to Atlanta and sit down with me, in person." "No lawyers?" Bradford said. "And the freeze." After the meeting, Elijah said, "After an agreement is reached. Not before." What kind of agreement? Bradford pressed the instinct of a capital allocator trying to calculate the shape of an obligation before committing to it. "The kind that changes something," Elijah said, and his voice was not cold when he said it, which Bradford would think about later, because a cold voice he would have understood. Not a press release. Not a training seminar. Something real with teeth that outlasts the people who agreed to it. Bradford was quiet. "There's a condition that applies to you specifically," Elijah said. "And to Richard Harlan. You'll hear it from him when he arrives. He'll explain it. You'll speak with Cassandra about the time and location," Elijah continued. "I'm at the Terminal F lounge. I'll be here until 2:30. After that, I'm chartering out regardless of whether your CEO has arrived." Bradford said, "He'll be there." "Good," Elijah said. He paused once more, and then, with the even, unhurried quality of someone who has said what needed to be said, and has no interest in prolonging what doesn't enjoy the rest of the flight. "Mr. Whitmore." He ended the call. He looked out the window at the terminal. The morning had moved into midday. The light was different now, flatter, less directional, the particular quality of a southern November noon that doesn't commit to warmth or cold. He thought about the light in Zurich, which would have been thinner and gray at this time of year, the city cold and beautiful along the river. He would get there. Just not today. He opened his laptop and went back to the market data because the Singapore situation had developed while he was on the call, and it was now requiring the kind of attention that a minor anomaly stops requiring when it stops being minor. He worked for 40 minutes with the focused, clean attention of someone who has finished one thing and begun another, and he did not check the financial news, and he did not search for his own name, and he did not check the Skybridge stock ticker, because none of those things required his attention the way the Singapore data did. And he had learned over years of being the only person in the room who understood what was happening to direct his attention at the things that needed it rather than the things that wanted it. His coffee had gone cold. He drank the rest of it anyway. Miriam Ashford had been a principal for 31 years before she retired, which meant she had spent 3 decades being the person in the room who was watching everything, keeping track of what was actually happening versus what people believed was happening, maintaining the mental register of who needed protection and who needed accountability and who needed simply to be seen. She had carried that habit into retirement the way you carry a posture you've held for decades, not consciously but completely, it having become the shape of how she moved through the world. She was on her way to Atlanta to spend 2 weeks with her daughter and her granddaughter Cora, who was 10 years old and currently dismantling every electronic device in the house to understand how it worked, which Miriam considered the most promising intellectual habit a person could develop, and which her daughter considered an expensive one. The flight was routine, the seat was comfortable, She had a good novel and a window, and then the man in the navy blazer had arrived in the aisle, and what followed had been brief and contained, and to anyone not paying the specific kind of attention Miriam paid to everything easily dismissible as a routine boarding confusion. A seat dispute, a passenger removed, the cabin returning to normal. The champagne poured, but Miriam had watched the whole of it, and what she had seen was not a seat dispute. She had seen a young man present his documentation clearly and politely and correctly, had heard the phrase, "He doesn't fit the profile," spoken by a man who had never once in the encounter looked directly at the young man he was talking about, had watched a flight attendant perform protocol over something that protocol was not designed to cover, and had seen the young man retrieve his bag and walk away with the particular dignity of someone who has decided that the space is not worth what staying in it would cost. She had not spoken. This was the stone in her chest. Not a heavy stone, but a persistent one, the specific weight of a witness who knew her role and did not fulfill it. She took a notepad from her carry-on. She wrote the date. She wrote what she had seen, not an editorial, not an argument. Just a witness account, the kind she had trained herself to write over decades of mediating student disputes and parent meetings, and the 1,000 small daily injustices of an institutional life. She wrote it in the plain, careful language of someone who has learned that plain language outlasts ornamentation. When she finished, she looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then she took out a second sheet. She wrote to Cora not to her daughter, but specifically to her granddaughter, because Cora was at the age where the world was still something that could be explained, and Miriam felt the particular urgency of a woman in her 70s to explain what she could while she still had the standing to explain it. She wrote about the young man in the hoodie. She wrote that he had not flinched, that he had not begged, that he had not performed his right to be there for the benefit of anyone watching, had not turned to the cabin for validation, had simply occupied his seat and his dignity with the same unremarkable certainty, and then, when the certainty was challenged, had retrieved his bag and left with more grace than anyone who removed him had any right to expect. She wrote, "I should have said something. I want you to know that I know that." She folded the letter. She put it in the front pocket of her carry-on where she kept the things she wanted to find easily. The man in 2C was asleep now, head against the window, breathing with the deep regularity of someone who had made his peace with whatever the morning required of him. The cabin hummed. The Atlantic below them was gray and enormous and indifferent, which Miriam found for the moment comforting. She put her reading glasses back on. She returned to her novel, and this time she actually read it. The emergency board session was not scheduled. It materialized the way board sessions in genuine crises always do, through a rapid cascade of bilateral calls that eventually produced a video conference link and a collection of faces on screens, each wearing the specific expression of someone who has been interrupted in the middle of something else and does not yet know how bad the interruption is. Linda Mercer presented the situation in the flat, orderly language of a CFO who has decided that the most useful thing she can do in a meeting like this is be the clearest person in the room. She walked them through it in sequence. The payment freeze, the Veritas Protocol 0 flag, the architect clause, the escrow, hold the 4 p.m. deadline. She did not offer interpretation or mitigation. She presented the facts in order and waited. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people doing rapid private calculations. The general counsel spoke first with the defensive instinct of a lawyer presented with a problem cease and desist language, tortious interference, potential, cyber regulation frameworks that might apply. He was detailed and thorough, and Linda let him finish before she said, with the patience of someone who has already thought through the same argument. The Veritas licensing agreement grants the architect explicit review rights under the architect clause, which we signed. The clause was drafted by Okafor's team and reviewed by our legal department before execution. There is no legal basis for challenging the freeze. The general counsel stopped talking. Paulette Reeves, the board member who handled institutional risk and who had been quiet until now, said the thing that everyone in the meeting had been thinking and no one had said. She said it without volume or drama, in the tone of someone reading a set of facts that don't require embellishment. We removed the man who holds the keys to our money from the first-class cabin of a domestic flight because he was wearing a hoodie. Nobody answered her. To accommodate Bradford Whitmore, she continued in the same tone, who is a shareholder with a preference for a specific seat, not a right to a specific seat. We made an informal judgment about a passenger's appearance and position, and the passenger turned out to be the architect of the financial infrastructure on which our entire operation depends. We didn't know who he was, someone said from one of the smaller windows on the screen. Paulette looked at that window. "That is exactly the problem," she said. "We didn't know who he was, and based on that not knowing, we decided he didn't belong there. That is the problem, not the specific identity. The process." The room was quiet again, but differently the quiet of people in the middle of something they will spend a long time thinking about afterward. The discussion turned to legal options, because that was the gravitational pull of any room containing lawyers. Linda let it run for 4 minutes, then said, "We have reviewed all available legal options. None of them resolve the escrow hold before 4 p.m. The only path to resolution is a direct conversation with Elijah Okafor." Richard's phone buzzed on the table in front of him. He looked at Bradford calling from the aircraft. He stepped out of the session. Bradford's voice when the call connected was the voice of someone who has been reduced not by cruelty, but by consequence, which is more permanent. He relayed what Elijah had said. The lounge, the personal meeting, no lawyers, an agreement with teeth, a condition. Richard listened. He said, "What is the condition?" Bradford told him what Elijah had told him. The condition would be explained in the meeting. He would hear it from Richard. Richard stood in the hallway outside the conference room and looked at the window at the end of the corridor, which faced south towards somewhere beyond many miles of city and highway and sky. The terminal, where a 24-year-old in a faded hoodie was waiting at a table near a window drinking cold coffee and working on financial data that had nothing to do with any of this. "All right," Richard said. He went back into the session. He told the board he was going to Atlanta. He told Linda to manage the acquisition targets team. Keep them in the building. Keep them calm. Explain that there was a technical complication being resolved at the highest level. He told the general counsel to put the injunction away. Paulette Reeves said, "Richard, whatever he asks for. Within reason." Richard looked at her. "Within reason?" he said. "Yes." He ended the call. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He walked to the elevator and he went to the roof where the corporate helicopter was waiting to take him to Teterboro, where the jet was being fueled. By midday, the Terminal F lounge had moved into its afternoon configuration. The frantic morning departure energy had dissipated and been replaced by the more settled pace of connecting travelers and delayed passengers and people who had given up on the idea of being somewhere else and were instead committed to being here, which gave the space a slightly more human quality than airports usually achieved. Elijah had moved from his window seat to a small table near the east-facing glass wall, where a narrow strip of November light still fell across the surface at a usable angle. He had eaten something from the terminal food options, a sandwich from a counter near the gate cluster. Adequate and honest about being adequate, and had charged his phone to full and completed 2 hours of focused work, which was more than he'd expected to accomplish given the morning. The television monitors above the bar area had picked up the story. He could see the chyron without hearing the audio. Skybridge Airlines faces banking system disruption. Ahead of major acquisition sources cite unspecified protocol breach. The chyron was careful and incomplete in the way that breaking financial news always is, in the first hours before the full shape of what happened has been established, and the second-day stories can be written. He watched it for a moment without expression. At the table next to his, a family was in the middle of the specific negotiation that families at airports always seem to be in the middle of two children. A mother, a father, and a tablet that both children had decided they needed simultaneously. The father was mediating with the exhausted diplomacy of a man who has been mediating the same dispute since approximately 6 a.m. and can see the shape of the next 18 years from where he's sitting. The mother was looking at her boarding pass with the expression of someone calculating whether the flight will actually leave on time and whether it matters. Elijah watched them for a moment longer than necessary. He thought about the Baltimore Library on winter mornings, the specific smell of it cold entering air and old paper. The third-floor reading room, where you could sit for hours undisturbed if you arrived early enough and chose the right table, which was the table by the far window. He had spent 3 winters in that library reading things he couldn't buy, and not once in those 3 winters had anyone told him he didn't belong there. The library had been his first evidence that some spaces existed without hierarchy, or at least with hierarchies organized around different values than the ones he encountered elsewhere. He thought about what he was going to ask Richard Harlan for, and whether it was the right thing to ask, and whether it was asking for something that would outlast the conversation, or just the legal document it would produce. He had spent the last 2 hours with that question, turning it over in the way he turned over problems that didn't resolve cleanly, not anxiously, but carefully, the way you handle something you want to keep in one piece. His phone showed 12:41 p.m. Richard had been in the air for approximately an hour. He would be here soon. Elijah refilled his water glass from the carafe the server had left on the table. He looked out the window at the tarmac, a different configuration of aircraft than the afternoon wave of departures assembling in the staging areas. He thought about Zurich, which he would reach tomorrow, where the conference would be waiting with the patience of institutions that understand that important people sometimes arrive late. He thought about his mother, who would be off shift now, probably at home, probably watching something on television with the specific, quiet enjoyment of someone who has worked hard for many years and earned the right to a quiet afternoon. He would call her when this was finished. She would ask how the meeting went, and he would say fine, and she would know from the specific quality of fine whether it had gone the way he'd hoped. He opened his notebook to a clean page. He wrote at the top, "What does this need to be?" Below it, in his small, precise handwriting, he wrote 3 things. He looked at them. He closed the notebook. Richard Harlan arrived at 1:09 p.m., slightly out of breath, and with his jacket in his hand, rather than on his body, which told Elijah everything he needed to know about the quality of Richard's morning. He spotted Elijah from across the lounge, crossed the space without stopping at any of the service counters, and sat down in the chair across the table. He was alone. No lawyers, no assistants. Elijah looked at him. "Mr. Harlan," he said. Richard Harlan was not as a professional matter a man who ran. He was a man who walked with intention, a deliberate forward-weighted gait that people who worked for him had learned to interpret as a mood indicator, the angle and pace of his movement communicating his internal state more accurately than his face, which he had trained over decades to remain professionally neutral. He had drivers for the running. He had assistants for the logistics. He had a COO and a CFO and a communications director and a team of people whose entire professional purpose was to stand between Richard and the necessity of reacting to things in real time. This was not a real-time situation that any of them could stand between him and. In the back of the SUV to Teterboro, he had made 11 calls in 40 minutes. Linda on the escrow management, the general counsel on the injunction question. Linda's answer confirmed, put it away, the board chair on the optics of what had happened and what was about to happen. The acquisition target's lawyer with the careful, controlled language of a man buying time without admitting he needs it. He was a good phone caller. Efficient, authoritative, 3 points per conversation, no excessive elaboration, and in the 40 minutes to Teterboro he covered everything that could be covered by phone. What could not be covered by phone was the thing he was going to Atlanta to do. In the jet somewhere over Pennsylvania, he had stopped making calls. His assistant, a woman named Dara, who had worked with him for 6 years and had a near-perfect read on when he needed to think versus when he needed to talk, had brought him a coffee and then sat down at the front of the cabin with her laptop and left him to the window, which was the correct decision. Richard looked at the clouds. He had built a company. He had built it genuinely, not by inheritance or by luck, but by accumulating understanding of a complex industry over 25 years, by making smart decisions more often than stupid ones, by caring about the operational details that CEOs at his level sometimes stopped caring about when the scale got large enough. He believed going into this morning that Skybridge was a company worth being proud of. What he was sitting with now over Pennsylvania at 30,000 feet was the question of whether the thing he'd built had a structural problem that his pride had prevented him from seeing clearly. Not a single failure. Patricia's decision, Cassandra's decision, Bradford's entitlement, but a pattern built into the material, the way the training worked, the weight given to certain passengers and the weight not given to others. The unwritten calibration that had told Cassandra, without needing to be told explicitly, that the man in seat 1A needed to be assessed, and the man in seat 2A did not. He had not written that calibration down anywhere. He had not issued a memo. But it was there in the culture, in the way things worked, and it was there because he had built the culture, and he had never looked at it directly. He drafted what he would say. He ran through versions, the CEO version, the managed liability version, the version that acknowledged enough without acknowledging everything, the version that bought goodwill without creating precedent. He tested them in his head, the way you test the weight of a thing before picking it up. Each version felt, when he turned it over completely, like a structure built on the wrong foundation. He started over. He didn't draft it again. He sat with the window and the clouds and the specific discomfort of a man who is about to have an honest conversation and is not entirely sure what will come out of him when the performance infrastructure is removed. Teterboro to Atlanta, 1 hour, 40 minutes. He landed at Hartsfield-Jackson's private terminal at 12:53 p.m. He declined the car that Dara had arranged from the terminal to the gate. It was faster to walk, and he needed the air. He walked through the connector corridor in his shirt sleeves, with his jacket over his arm, and his phone in his pocket, and he moved with the intention he always moved with the forward-weighted gait, but without the management of it, just the movement. He saw Elijah from 20 feet away, a young man at a small table by the window, laptop closed, notebook closed, a glass of water in front of him, looking out at the tarmac with the unhurried attention of someone who is simply present in the room, requiring nothing from it except the light. He was wearing the same hoodie he had boarded in that morning. The battered leather bag was on the floor by his chair. Richard straightened his jacket and put it on. Not as a power move, as a gesture of respect, the equivalent of arriving at something as the version of yourself that the meeting deserves. He crossed the lounge. He sat down. He looked at Elijah Okafor, 24 years old. Faded navy hoodie, worn sneakers, completely unbothered, and he understood in a way he had not understood from the description, or the briefing, or the 90 minutes of background research he'd done on the jet, that he was in the presence of someone who did not need anything from this conversation, except for it to produce a result that mattered. "Mr. Harlan," Elijah said. Richard introduced himself. Elijah said he knew. Richard said he'd read Elijah's work, not the Veritas marketing materials, the actual technical papers, the original 2021 behavioral risk model. He said it because it was true, and because the morning had stripped away his interest in saying things that weren't. Elijah acknowledged this with a brief nod and waited. Richard began with the apology. He had the CEO version ready, measured, structured, specific enough to convey genuine accountability without creating runaway liability. the language of a man who has been in rooms where words have legal weight and has learned to construct sentences with load-bearing walls. He delivered it. It was good. It was, as apologies go, professionally excellent. When he finished, Elijah was quiet. Then he asked, "Why did it happen?" Richard started to explain. He described the incident, Cassandra's decision, Bradford's request, the accommodation policy for Chairman's Circle members, the crew authority protocol that allowed senior flight attendants to make passenger management decisions at their own discretion. He was thorough and accurate, and he was, as he spoke, aware that he was describing a mechanism and not answering the question. Elijah waited. Richard stopped. He had the experience very rarely in his career of being in a room where the other person's patience was more powerful than his own authority, and this was one of those rooms. He sat with the incomplete answer for a moment. Then he started again, and this time without the structure. "We built a hierarchy," he said, "not in writing, not in any policy document you could find, but in the way we trained people, in the weight we gave to certain passengers and the weight we didn't give to others, in the signals we sent about whose comfort mattered and whose could be negotiated. Bradford Whitmore has been a Global Services member for 15 years. He spends $500,000 a year with us, and somewhere along the way we stopped treating that as a business relationship and started treating it as a different category of personhood." He paused. "And when you have a culture that treats certain people as a different category of personhood, you don't need to write down instructions about what to do when the categories conflict. People already know." Elijah looked at him. "That's a more honest answer," he said. Richard offered what he had prepared to offer. Cassandra terminated Bradford banned permanently a compensation package for Elijah's inconvenience, a public apology issued under Skybridge's corporate communications protocols. He presented each one as a serious commitment because he meant each one as a serious commitment. Elijah declined each one quietly without drama. "Firing Cassandra doesn't change what made Cassandra possible," he said. "Banning Bradford doesn't change the culture that made Bradford's expectation reasonable, and I don't want compensation." He looked at Richard steadily. "I want the thing that made this morning possible to be different, not just at Skybridge. Different in a way that has to be reported publicly, that has external oversight, that produces measured outcomes rather than stated intentions, and that continues whether or not you're still the CEO." Richard was quiet. "That's a structural ask," he said. "Yes," Elijah said. Richard looked at the window, then back. What specifically? Elijah opened his notebook. He had written 3 things on the clean page. He read them. First, a complete overhaul of Skybridge's passenger interaction protocols, drafted with input from an independent civil rights organization, not the company's own diversity team, with specific behavioral benchmarks, rather than attitudinal targets. Second, independent annual auditing of those benchmarks with results reported publicly for a minimum of 3 consecutive years. The reports to be filed with a designated external oversight board, whose composition Elijah would have input on. Third, a personal contribution from both Richard Harlan and Bradford Whitmore. Not corporate funds, personal funds equal to 50% of their individual gains from the Meridian acquisition directed to a foundation supporting first-generation college students from underserved communities. Not announced, not marketed, just done. Richard looked at the notebook. He looked at Elijah. "You understand what you're asking from Bradford," he said. "He's going to fight it." "He can fight it," Elijah said. "He's on a plane right now. He has 6 hours to think about the alternative." Richard leaned back in his chair. He ran through the numbers in his head. His own share of the acquisition gains was approximately $22 million in stock options. 50% was $11 million. It was a lot of money. It was also held against what the morning had cost and what the afternoon would cost if the deal died a manageable number. "The third condition is personal," he said. "Bradford's is personal. I can't commit for him. "I know," Elijah said. "You'll call him. I'll wait." There was a pause, and then, from Richard, the closest thing to a moment of genuine, unscripted honesty that the morning had produced the thing that Elijah had been waiting for, even if he hadn't named it explicitly. Richard put his elbows on the table and looked at Elijah directly and said, "If I'm being truthful, if I had walked onto that plane this morning and seen you in seat 1A before Bradford boarded, I'd have made the same assessment they did. I'd have looked at the hoodie, looked at your age, and formed a judgment I wouldn't have examined." Elijah looked at him. "I need you to know that I understand that about myself," Richard said. "I'm not saying it for your forgiveness. I'm saying it because the thing I'm agreeing to has to be built on an honest foundation, or it doesn't hold." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "That's the most important thing you've said since you sat down," he said. And then with something that was not quite warmth, but was something in its vicinity, "That foundation will hold." They arrived at 1:34 p.m., 3 of them, Skybridge's senior litigation team in the suits that corporate lawyers wear to communicate that they are expensive without communicating that they enjoy being expensive, which is the specific sartorial challenge of the profession. The lead was a man named Conrad who had silver hair and a briefcase that appeared to contain documents, and spiritually, the concept of leverage. They had followed Richard from the corporate jet terminal without his instruction, which was either diligence or the specific failure mode of lawyers who mistake initiative for service. Conrad located Elijah in the lounge with the scanning efficiency of someone trained to identify targets, strode across the room, and placed a folder on the table between them with the weight of a man placing a trump card. "Mr. Okafor," he said. "I am lead counsel for Skybridge Airlines. I have here a cease and desist order, a notice of intent to pursue action on grounds of tortious interference with a legitimate commercial transaction, and a preliminary injunction application citing unauthorized manipulation of licensed financial infrastructure." Elijah looked at the folder. He looked at Conrad. He did not touch the folder. "Is there mustard on my tie?" Conrad asked, confused. "No," Elijah said. "I was just checking." He looked back at Conrad with the expression of someone who has processed the threat, evaluated the threat, and concluded that the threat requires approximately as much of his attention as the folder required his hands. The Veritas licensing agreement, executed by Skybridge Holdings in March of last year, grants the system Architect Unilateral Protocol 0 review rights under Section 7, Paragraph 3 in the event of documented behaviors consistent with reputational risk to the banking network. That documentation exists. The clause was reviewed and signed by your legal team. He paused. "I invite you to call whoever you'd like. The FBI, the SEC, the FAA. I will be happy to share the audit logs of the behavioral patterns that triggered the flag. I expect those logs will be of interest to several of the organizations you'd be calling." Conrad opened his mouth. Richard said, "Put it away, Conrad." Conrad turned. "Sir, we have a legitimate—" I said, "Put it away." Richard's voice was quiet, which made it more effective than volume. "All of it. Folder briefcase injunction. Put it away and leave. Sir, the board." "The board is going to be fine," Richard said with the specific certainty of someone who has spent the last 2 hours doing the math and arrived at a conclusion. "I am in the middle of a conversation. Please leave us." Conrad looked at Elijah. Elijah had returned to looking out the window, his expression carrying the unhurried quality of someone who has correctly predicted the outcome of a situation and is waiting for the prediction to finish being confirmed. Conrad gathered the folder. He and his 2 colleagues withdrew across the lounge with the compressed dignity of people who have been dismissed in front of an audience and are managing their reaction in real time. The lounge settled back to its ambient rhythms. Richard looked at Elijah. "I should have told them not to come." You had a lot on your mind this morning, Elijah said. Something shifted in the air between them. Not warmth, exactly, but the particular reduction in formality that happens when people have agreed to be honest with each other and have discovered somewhat to their mutual surprise that the other person actually means it. Richard turned his chair slightly, no longer sitting at the confrontational angle of across the table, but at the slightly oblique angle of alongside the way people sit when they are working on something rather than negotiating it. The structural reform, Richard said. The Civil Rights Organization for the Protocol Review. Do you have one in mind? I do, Elijah said. He named it. Richard took out his phone and typed the name. The auditing 3 years public reporting, that's manageable. I'll need to frame it to the board as a reputational risk management measure, which it is, because I need their support to make it durable. Frame it however you need to, Elijah said. The durability is what matters. Richard nodded. The personal contribution. He put his phone down. I'll call Bradford now. I'll wait, Elijah said. Richard dialed Bradford from the satellite patch through the aircraft line, the same line Cassandra had used, the same cockpit phone Bradford, in the same seat. The champagne long finished and replaced with something stronger by the sound of it. Though, Bradford's voice when he answered was not blurred so much as stripped the voice of a man who has spent 3 hours alone with consequences and has arrived at a form of clarity that is not peace, but is at least honesty. Richard Bradford said. Not Jonathan. He had always called Richard by his first name, the habit of a man with a shareholder's sense of relationship. Today, the first name sounded different, less like familiarity and more like a request. Bradford. Richard kept his voice level. I'm sitting across from Elijah Okafor. We've reached an agreement on the structural elements, the protocol reform, the oversight framework. There's one condition remaining that applies to both of us personally. He laid it out plainly, 50% of their individual gains from the Meridian acquisition donated to a first-generation college student foundation. His share approximately $11 million. Bradford's share approximately $7 million based on his stake position. Bradford was quiet. Richard listened to the quiet. Bradford said, $7 million. Yes. That's not a fine, Bradford said. That's not a settlement. That's the price, Richard said, and his voice did not apologize for the word. $7 million, or the deal dies at 4 o'clock, and your stake in Skybridge is worth what it was before the Meridian routes, which, given the stock movement this afternoon, is approximately 40% of what it was this morning. Do the math, Bradford. The pause on the line was the sound of a man doing exactly that. Richard looked at Elijah, who was looking out the window with the patient attention of someone who has set a mechanism in motion and is allowing it to run. He was not watching Richard's face for signs of progress. He was not following the negotiation with visible anxiety. He was, as far as Richard could tell, thinking about something else entirely, which was simultaneously the most unsettling and the most clarifying thing about him. Bradford said, fine. One word flat, the word of a man who has arrived at the end of a calculation and found the answer he didn't want but will accept. Fine. $7 million. Where does it go? Richard told him the name of the foundation. Bradford wrote it down. Richard could hear him writing. Neither of them said anything else of consequence. Neither of them needed to. Richard ended the call. He looked at Elijah. He agreed, he said. On a recorded line. I know, Elijah said. He pulled a small device from his jacket pocket, a phone-sized recorder, the kind that journalists and researchers carry. He pressed stop. He set it on the table between them. Richard looked at it. He started to say something. It's admissible in 6 states, Elijah said. Mine is not one of them, and we're in Georgia, but it's a record. He paused. I'm not going to use it against you. I'm going to use it to hold you to what you've said if the holding becomes necessary. That's different. Richard nodded. It was different. He understood the distinction. Richard took the legal pad he'd brought from the jet and wrote out the pledge in plain English. No legal syntax, no clauses, no conditions. The structural reform commitment. The independent oversight, the personal donations, the timeline. He wrote it in handwriting that was not the handwriting of a man who was certain about what he was doing, but was the handwriting of a man who had decided to do it anyway. He signed it. He pushed it across the table. Elijah looked at the legal pad. He read it. Then he asked, "The woman in 3F. On the flight this morning. Do you know her name?" Richard blinked. No. Why, she watched what happened. Elijah said, "She was there when your crew told me I didn't belong in my seat. She didn't cause any of this. She didn't do anything wrong, and she didn't do anything right. She was just there." He looked at Richard. "Does your company know she existed?" Richard was quiet. "She matters," Elijah said. "The people who watch and say nothing matter as much as the people who act. Your reform framework needs to account for them, too, not to punish them, but because the culture that made this morning possible depends on witnesses staying silent." He paused. "Build something that makes it easier for the next person in 3F to speak." Richard wrote that down on the legal pad, below his signature. Elijah opened his laptop. He navigated to the Veritas administrative dashboard. He found the Protocol 0 review flag on Skybridge Global Holdings. He looked at it for a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4. He typed a short authorization sequence. He pressed enter. At 2:47 p.m., the liquidity freeze on Skybridge Global Holdings lifted. The escrow account unlocked. The $1.7 billion transfer authorization was released to the consortium bank. Richard's phone came alive in his hand, a sustained burst of notifications, texts arriving too fast to read individually. The CFO's name at the top of the list, then the board chair, then the acquisition target's lawyer. He looked at the screen without answering any of them, the way you look at a fire that has been put out and are still processing the fact that it is no longer burning. He set the phone face down on the table. He looked at Elijah. "The funds cleared," Richard said. It was not a question, and it didn't need confirmation, but saying it aloud was something he needed to do to mark the moment, to let it be real. "Yes," Elijah said. Richard sat with that for a moment. Then, "You were never angry." He said it the way people say things when they are trying to understand them, rather than comment on them with the genuine curiosity of someone who has spent a career in rooms where anger is a primary currency and has just met someone who did not spend any of it. "Anger is inefficient," Elijah said. Richard turned the legal pad on the table. He looked at what he'd written. He looked at the line he'd added below his signature about the witnesses. "I spent the flight here drafting what I was going to say to you. I had 5 versions, I know," Elijah said. "How?" "Because you abandoned all of them about 40 minutes in." Elijah said, "I watched you adjust." Richard almost smiled. It was a strange, surprised expression. The expression of a man encountering something he hadn't expected in a context where he'd expected very little. He looked down at the legal pad. The words he'd written were plain and specific and undeniable, and they were the most expensive thing he had ever written on a yellow legal pad in the terminal of an airport while missing a press conference he had been looking forward to for 8 months. "Why this?" he asked. "Why not the money? A settlement? A legal process? Something with a financial resolution? You have the means to make it financial." Elijah was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the tarmac, the afternoon wave of departures in staging the particular busyness of a major airport's midday, the machinery of 100,000 daily decisions about who goes where and how and whether there's room. Then he looked back at Richard. "Because I don't want the airline to burn," he said. "I want it to be different." Richard nodded. Something settled in his face. Not relief, which would have been too simple for what the morning had been, but a kind of resolution, the specific quality of a moment closing properly. Elijah stood. He zipped his bag. He slung it over his shoulder. The battered leather messenger bag, the electrical tape on the strap, the scratched buckle, the thing Cassandra had looked at this morning and found wanting. "You should fix seat 2A, Elijah said. He was already turning. The recliner. That's where this all started. He walked out of the lounge. Richard sat alone at the table. He looked at the legal pad. He picked up his phone and began working through the messages, the CFO first, then the board chair, then the acquisition target's lawyer. His voice as he began to speak was different from the voice he'd arrived with in ways that would take him a long time to fully understand. Darnell Webb had worked the Skybridge maintenance floor at Hartsfield-Jackson for 11 years, and in those 11 years, he had watched the company's executive compensation package grow by approximately 400%, while the pension contributions for ground-level workers had been quietly incrementally reduced 3 times each reduction announced in the kind of corporate language that is designed to sound like a gift while functioning as a subtraction. He was not a political man. He was not by temperament a person who looked for ways to make trouble. He was a person who arrived on time, did the work correctly, and went home at the end of the shift to a house he shared with his wife and their daughter, who was 12 and wanted to be a veterinarian, and whose college savings account Darnell had been adding to, with the specific patient determination of a man who understands that the difference between wanting something and having something is usually a long, quiet accumulation of small decisions. He had downloaded the cockpit audio log from Flight 1140 on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks after the incident during a routine access he had legitimate clearance for in his maintenance capacity. He had not intended to do anything with it. He had listened to it in the parking garage after his shift sitting in his car eating the sandwich he'd packed that morning, and he had listened to Bradford Whitmore and Cassandra Vane, and then to Elijah Okafor, that quiet, level voice precise as a column of numbers reciting his rights, and then saying nothing more. And he had sat in the parking garage for 25 minutes after the audio ended, not moving the sandwich forgotten in his lap. He had heard the news coverage of the Skybridge banking disruption. He had heard the management language applied to what had happened, technical complication, protocol, adjustment, successfully resolved, and he had recognized the language as what it was, which was the sound of an institution describing something damaging in the tones of something routine. He uploaded the audio on a Tuesday afternoon. He did not do it for money. He did not do it for recognition. He uploaded it because he had a daughter who wanted to be a veterinarian and who would someday walk into rooms and have people make assessments based on what they saw before she spoke, and he wanted those rooms to have already encountered the sound of what that cost. By Tuesday evening, the clip had reached 4 million views. By Wednesday morning, every major news organization had run the audio. The television chyrons were different now. No longer banking system disruption, but Skybridge crew tells passenger, you don't fit the profile full recording surfaces. Morning programs ran segments. Legal analysts discussed the architect clause. Cultural commentators discussed the hoodie. But what most of the coverage returned to what spread and stayed and was clipped and reshared in the specific way that things spread when they've captured something true was not Bradford's arrogance or Cassandra's authority, or even the freeze and the merger. It was the 30 seconds of audio in which Elijah Okafor, having been told he was a security risk for sitting in the seat he paid for, stood up and retrieved his bag in complete silence and walked away, and not a single person in that first-class cabin said anything at all. The silence of the cabin was the story. Not the villain's words, not the hero's competence. The silence of 30 people who watched and decided for reasons each of them would carry differently that it was not their business to speak. Miriam Ashford in a house in Atlanta watched the clip on her daughter's phone at the kitchen table. She watched it twice. Her granddaughter Cora was at the table doing homework, and after the second viewing, Miriam said I was there. Cora looked up. That was the man Miriam said yes. Cora looked at the phone and then back at her grandmother with the focused attention of a 10-year-old in the process of filing something away. "Did you say something?" Cora asked. Miriam was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. Cora nodded, not with judgment, with the gravity of a child who is learning something real. The world Bradford Whitmore had built did not collapse in a single dramatic moment, which would have been in some ways easier. A clean break, a defined before and after the narrative clarity of a life changed in an instant. What happened to Bradford was more gradual and more thorough. A slow, grinding attrition of the structures that his identity had been organized around, each one going separately, each loss revealing how dependent the remaining structures were on the ones that had gone. The Whitmore Capital Board met on a Monday morning 2 weeks after the audio went public. Bradford sat at the head of the table, his table the one he had sat at the head of for 22 years, and listened to the chairwoman he had appointed read a prepared statement about fiduciary responsibility and reputational liability. He voted against his own removal. The vote was 11-1, and the one was his which told him with a mathematical precision that suited his training exactly how many people in that room still believed he should be there. He retreated to his estate in Greenwich. The gates were large and old and expensive, and they kept photographers at a distance, but they did not keep the internet at any distance, and the internet was not going to forget Bradford Whitmore. His country club sent a letter he would not see it categorized as expulsion. The letter was careful about that, a man of Bradford's legal resources having the ability to complicate an expulsion, but membership suspended pending review of conduct inconsistent with community standards produced the same practical effect. He stopped going. He found when he stopped going that he had not been going for the food or the course or even the golf, but for the specific daily confirmation that he belonged somewhere, and when the confirmation was withdrawn, he discovered that the belonging had been the whole point. His wife Elena did not file for divorce. She was a woman of considered action rather than reactive ones, and she understood that the legal and financial complexity of a divorce in the aftermath of a public incident would produce consequences she was not interested in accelerating. What she did was pack a substantial bag and move to their house in Tuscany, and she did not return calls with the regularity she once had. And when she did call, it was with the careful, considered quality of a woman managing a relationship from a distance that she had not yet decided was permanent. The charitable donation $7 million and change the pledge made on a recorded line at 30,000 feet was challenged. Bradford retained attorneys. The attorneys presented a duress argument. The recording was played in the judge's chambers, not the full audio, just the 30 seconds of Bradford at the satellite phone agreeing to the terms, and the judge, a woman who had taken Skybridge Airlines on numerous occasions, and who had formed in the privacy of her own chambers a clear assessment of the character of the agreement, ruled it binding. Bradford wrote the check. His hand shook, and he was aware of his hand shaking, and the awareness felt important in a way he couldn't articulate to anyone. $7,200,000 made out to the foundation whose name he had written in the margin of an Atlantic Crossings menu at 30,000 feet. He did not go to prison. He did not go bankrupt, though the combination of the donation, the stock decline, and the legal fees produced a net worth that was meaningfully smaller than the one he'd held 2 months earlier. He was not destroyed. He was reduced in status and access in the daily experience of being a man whose presence in a room changes the room's temperature. He was simply a man now in a house in Connecticut, and the house was large, and the grounds were well maintained, and the evenings were very quiet. He watched cable news most nights. He ate dinner at the kitchen table rather than the dining room because the dining room required a reason and he didn't have one anymore. On a Thursday evening in February, 3 months after the incident, he opened his banking app out of habit. He had opened it every day since the morning on the plane, a reflex he couldn't break, checking that the balance was what it should be. And he sat for a long moment looking at the number, which was a real number again, a large and comfortable one, and he thought about how it had felt when it said 0. He closed the app. He turned off the television. He sat in the quiet and held the specific, unfamiliar weight of a man who has not yet figured out what to do with what he now knows about himself. The restructuring of Cassandra Vane's role was announced internally on a Friday afternoon in the particular end-of-week timing that communications professionals use for things they want to deliver without inviting extensive discussion. She was not fired. Skybridge's legal counsel had assessed the PR mathematics of a termination carefully and concluded that the optics of a public firing combined with Cassandra's 9-year tenure and the possibility of a wrongful termination claim presented more downside than the alternative, which was to restructure her into a role that was undeniably still employed, but was, in the specific lived experience of her professional life, a different world entirely. She was reassigned to the Skybridge Customer Resolution Center in Newark, which handled complaints, compensation claims, rebooking for disrupted passengers, lost and damaged baggage, and the full spectrum of circumstances in which a passenger's experience with an airline has gone wrong in ways that require a human being to address rather than an automated system. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week in a building that was not an aircraft dealing with people who had not chosen to be here and were most of them managing something difficult on top of whatever else their day contained. She was good at it. This surprised her in the first weeks, and then it stopped surprising her because she had always been a skilled communicator. 9 years in premium service had built genuine technical competence in managing complex interpersonal situations under pressure. And the Resolution Center turned out to require exactly the same core competencies as first-class flight service stripped of the hierarchy that had organized what those competencies were deployed in the service of. Here she had no Bradford Whitmore to prioritize, no Chairman's Circle member whose comfort outweighed another passenger's need, no implicit calibration telling her which person's problem mattered more. She had a counter and a system and people who needed something resolved, and she resolved things. She thought about Elijah frequently, not with guilt. Exactly. Guilt had a specific shape that she had inhabited in the first weeks and then moved through. Because guilt that doesn't produce change is just self-punishment, and she was not interested in self-punishment for its own sake. She thought about him with the ongoing attention of something she was trying to understand, the specific quality of his stillness in that seat, the way his dignity had required nothing from anyone in the cabin to exist, the way he had walked away, and the walking away had been somehow more powerful than any version of staying. 3 months into her new role, a young black man came to her counter on a Tuesday morning. He was maybe 22, wearing a jacket that looked like his good one, carrying a guitar case by the handle, and he had missed a connection because his first flight had been delayed, and the airline's rebooking system had placed him on a flight that didn't leave until the following afternoon. He had a performance that night in Chicago. He laid out the situation clearly and politely, with the patient thoroughness of someone who has learned to provide every relevant detail up front, because experience has taught him that the details will be asked for anyway. Cassandra looked at his situation. She found him a routing through a smaller carrier that would get him to Chicago by 6 p.m., 3 hours before his performance. Not comfortable, but possible. She booked it. She applied a service recovery voucher to cover the fare difference. She printed his boarding pass and handed it across the counter. He looked at the pass. He looked at the routing. He looked up at her with the specific, grateful surprise of someone who has arrived at a counter expecting to be told what can't be done and has instead been told what can. "Thank you," he said. "I really appreciate it. I wasn't sure." "You had time," she said. Her voice was different from the one that had told a young man he didn't fit the profile. It was still composed, still professional, but it was direct in a way that professional composure sometimes prevents carrying the warmth of someone who has stopped performing warmth and started meaning it. "Go catch your flight." He thanked her again and walked toward the gate. She watched him go. She stood at the counter for a moment before the next passenger approached, and she thought about the guitar case and the 6 p.m. flight and the performance he would make or wouldn't make, and how much of his life existed in the 30 seconds she had spent looking at his situation rather than explaining the policy. She thought about Elijah's bag, the battered leather messenger, the electrical tape on the strap, and what she had thought when she'd seen it and what it had contained. She turned to the next passenger. The Skybridge Passenger Dignity Initiative was announced without fanfare on a Tuesday morning 6 months after Flight 140, which was a deliberate choice. Not because the company was ashamed of it, but because it had been decided in the planning process that announcing it loudly was the kind of thing companies do when they want credit for an intention, rather than accountability for a result, and the framework they'd built was organized around results. The civil rights organization that Elijah had named was called Equal Transit Project, a nonprofit that had spent a decade researching differential treatment patterns in transportation systems, and had developed in that time a specific and rigorous methodology for measuring outcomes rather than attitudes. They had spent 4 months working with Skybridge's operational team, not the communications team, not the diversity and inclusion office, but the operational team, the people who wrote the protocols that governed daily passenger interaction, and the document that emerged was specific in a way that organizational reform commitments rarely are. The old language, accommodate high-profile passenger requests at crew discretion, was removed entirely. In its place, a framework built around the principle that passenger accommodation decisions had to be documentable, reviewable, and consistent regardless of the passenger's status tier. The training was rewritten from scratch. The scenarios used in new crew training were drawn directly from audit records of past incidents, including Flight 140. The independent audit mechanism was built with teeth quarterly data reporting to Equal Transit Project annual public reports with specific outcome metrics. A review board with the authority to require corrective action rather than simply recommend it. The first quarterly report was imperfect audits. Never look good in the first cycle because that's when you see what was actually happening versus what you said was happening, and it was published anyway with a note from the CEO acknowledging the gaps and specifying what was being done. Richard Harlan presented the framework to the board 6 months after the incident and resigned the same day, effective in 60 days to allow for transition. He had thought about this decision on the flight back from Atlanta, and several times over the subsequent months, and each time he arrived at the same conclusion that the most useful thing he could do for the initiative he had committed to was to remove himself from the position where his continued presence would allow people to frame it as his project rather than the company's obligation. He wrote a short, specific letter of resignation that explained this reasoning in plain language, which was unusual for resignation letters, and which the board found, depending on which member you asked, either admirable or baffling. The board appointed an interim CEO, a woman named Gloria Osei, who had started as a gate agent at Skybridge's Atlanta hub 22 years ago, and had risen through the operational side of the company with the quiet steadiness of someone who knows every part of the machine, because she has worked every part of the machine. She had not been the loudest advocate for any particular position during the incident's aftermath. She had been the person who, when the first quarterly audit came back with its uncomfortable numbers, read every page without flinching, and then called a meeting to discuss what they meant. Her first act as interim CEO was to frame the quarterly audit report, not the press release, not the announcement, the actual audit document with its gaps and its acknowledgments and its specific imperfect commitments, and hang it in the lobby of Skybridge's Atlanta headquarters. A colleague asked her why that document, rather than something more polished. Because polished is what we were before, Gloria said. Honest is what we're trying to be. Miriam Ashford had been carrying the letter to Cora in the front pocket of her carry-on for the 2 weeks of her visit, and she gave it to her granddaughter on the last morning, which was a Saturday. Cora's father having made waffles, the house carrying the particular warm noise of a family morning cartoons from the living room, the smell of coffee, someone's shoes being found under the couch after a brief search. Cora was at the kitchen table with a circuit board and a pair of small pliers attempting something that Miriam had not asked for an explanation of, because the explanation would take 20 minutes and the attempt was more interesting to watch. She had her grandmother's focused quality, the same concentration directed at different things. Miriam put the letter on the table beside the circuit board. Cora looked at it. She looked at her grandmother. She put down the pliers and picked up the letter with the slightly ceremonial attention that children give to objects delivered with weight. She read it. Miriam watched her read the way her eyes moved through it, carefully pausing at certain points, going back once to reread something. Cora was not a fast reader, but she was a thorough one, and she read the letter the way her grandmother had written it all the way through without skipping. When she finished, she folded it carefully along its original creases. "Did the man get in trouble?" she asked. "No, baby," Miriam said. "He had it handled." Cora turned this over in her mind, with the visible processing of a child for whom having it handled was an interesting category to examine. How he built something that meant nobody could ignore him, Miriam said. Not by being loud, by being essential. Cora looked at the circuit board, then back at her grandmother. "Why didn't you say something when you saw it happening?" Miriam looked at her granddaughter, who was 10 years old and asking the most honest question anyone had asked her about the morning. She had prepared for this. Question had turned it over on the plane, in the car, in the guest room at night. And she had not prepared an answer so much as prepared to say the truth. "Because I was afraid," she said. "Not of them. Of it, of getting in the middle of something and having it turned toward me. That's a real fear, Cora, and I want you to know it's real, because I think some people who could speak up don't, because they don't understand that their fear is understandable, and they think silence means they're cowards." She paused. "But I also want you to know that understanding why you were afraid doesn't mean the silence was right. I knew what was happening was wrong. I sat there and I was afraid and I didn't say anything, and that man walked up that jet bridge alone." She held her granddaughter's eyes. "I think about that." Cora was quiet for a moment. I would have said something, she said, with the absolute conviction of a 10-year-old who has not yet learned the specific weight of a moment like that. Then almost immediately she said, "I think I would have." "That I think," Miriam said, "is you starting to understand it." Cora picked up her pliers again. She worked on the circuit board in silence for a while, and Miriam drank her coffee and watched the morning light come through the kitchen window and thought about the letter she had also been carrying, the one to Skybridge Airlines. Not angry, not demanding, just a witness account plainly told. She had mailed it from Atlanta before she flew home. She had not expected a response, and she hadn't received one, not a personal one. But 3 weeks later, browsing the Equal Transit Project's website for an unrelated reason, she had found in the methodology section of Skybridge's audit framework a notation in plain language. Incidents of passenger differential treatment are not limited to the primary parties involved. Bystander experience must be captured and accounted for in operational review processes. She had read that sentence 3 times. She didn't know if her letter had anything to do with it. She suspected it might have had something to do with the note Elijah had asked Richard to add below his signature on the legal pad. She didn't need to know for certain. It was there in plain language in a public document. The witness in 3F existed. The framework knew she existed. That was enough. She finished her coffee. She helped Cora with the circuit board for 20 minutes, which mostly involved holding things while Cora connected them, and it turned out to be a small light that blinked in a pattern. "What does it do?" Miriam asked. "It blinks," Cora said. "That's it. That's the first part," Cora said with the patient certainty of someone who knows exactly where she's going and understands that other people just need a moment to catch up. Miriam smiled. She thought about a young man in a faded hoodie walking out of a terminal into an Atlanta afternoon, carrying a battered bag with electrical tape on the strap, heading toward the next thing he was building. She thought, yes, that's the first part. The charter was a modest aircraft, a Cessna Citation, clean and functional. the kind of plane that says, "I am going somewhere efficiently," rather than "I am going somewhere expensively," and it departed from Skybridge's private terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson at 3:45 p.m., 6 minutes after Elijah had confirmed the funds had cleared and the dissolution of his obligation to remain in any particular place. He was the only passenger which he preferred for certain kinds of travel, specifically the kind that followed a morning requiring sustained attention and left him with the quiet desire to be somewhere small and bounded for a few hours. He settled into the left window seat habit and watched the tarmac through the glass as the aircraft completed its pre-flight checks with the routine efficiency of a well-maintained machine operated by people who know their work. Atlanta was visible beyond the terminal buildings in the early afternoon light, the city spreading out in the specific confident way of southern cities that have decided they have room to grow and have acted accordingly. He opened his laptop. He sent the message to his Zurich contact, "Unavoidable delay. Arriving tomorrow. We'll need the morning session rescheduled," and then he thought about the second sentence and the offer to explain when he arrived, and he thought about what the explanation would be, and he deleted the second sentence. The delay spoke for itself. He would explain in Zurich to the extent that an explanation was needed, which was probably less than people would assume. He closed the laptop. He looked out the window. He thought about his mother, who was off shift now, and would be home probably in her living room, the one where the television faced the window that looked out onto the street where he had grown up, where she had watched him walk to school and watched him walk back from school, and where he had on the morning she found the mortgage release note stood on the front stoop and waited and felt when the door opened something very specific and complete. He would call her when he landed in New York before the connecting flight to Zurich. She would ask how the day was. He would say long. She would understand from the particular quality of long that it had been significant, and she would not ask for the specifics because she never asked for the specifics. She asked for the emotional truth which he always gave her, which was a different and more important kind of accuracy. He thought about Bradford Whitmore, and then he noticed that he was thinking about Bradford Whitmore, and made a deliberate choice to stop, not from bitterness or discipline, but from the clean preference of someone who has finished processing a thing and would like to move on to the next thing. Bradford would carry what he was going to carry. That was Bradford's work, not his. He thought about the Zurich presentation, specifically the second section, the behavioral risk expansion module which he'd been reworking for 3 weeks, and which felt now more completely finished than it had at 5:30 that morning. The morning had confirmed in a thorough and somewhat operationally inconvenient way that the reasoning behind the expansion module was sound. He made a mental note to add 2 sentences to the opening of the section, not about today specifically, but about the principle the day had demonstrated that behavioral patterns which appear small in isolation accumulate into institutional realities that have quantifiable consequences. The aircraft lifted. Atlanta fell away beneath him in the way cities fall away from altitude. First the specific details, then the patterns, then the shape, then just light and geometry. He put on his headphones. He listened to something without words for the first hour, which was what he listened to when he wanted to think without being pushed in any particular direction. The clouds outside the window were high and thin, the light above them clean and white. He did not think about Seat 1A. He thought about what came next. The Zurich Global FinTech Summit occupied the 3rd and 4th floors of a conference center on the limit, a building of glass and pale wood that managed to feel both modern and old in the specific way of Swiss institutions that have decided to be permanent rather than fashionable. 500 attendees, 3 days of program organized around the architecture of financial systems and the question of what those systems were at their most foundational level for. Elijah presented on the second morning, which was the slot he'd been given when he'd explained his delayed arrival to the conference coordinator, who had rearranged the program with the gracious efficiency of someone who understood that certain speakers were worth accommodating. He stood at the podium in a fresh version of essentially the same outfit he'd worn on the plane. Dark jeans, a clean hoodie, and a slightly different shade of navy. The same scuffed sneakers because he had not packed differently for Zurich than he packed for anywhere else, which was a choice as deliberate as everything else about how he moved through the world. The room was the respectful quiet of a professional audience that has decided based on the program notes and the preceding 30 minutes of build-up from the conference chair to pay attention. He began with the architecture veritas as a system, its penetration, its function, and then he moved to the expansion module, and when he described what it did, the room became a different kind of quiet. The behavioral risk module that had been 6 months earlier, a theoretical framework for detecting discriminatory institutional patterns as financial risk indicators, was now something else. A validated methodology with a real-world case study that had frozen a $1.7 billion transaction and produced as a downstream result a publicly audited operational reform in a major carrier. He did not describe the Sky Bridge incident as the case study by name. He described it in the language of the module, an entity whose behavioral patterns triggered a Protocol 0 flag, generating a resolution that produced measurable structural change rather than surface correction. The audience filled in the name themselves. The news cycle had made it universally available. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment before the applause, which was the specific pause that follows a presentation when the audience is processing something they hadn't anticipated arriving at a pause that was more valuable to Elijah than the applause. A reporter found him afterward in the corridor outside the conference room where he was drinking water and reviewing a message from his Zurich contact about the afternoon's roundtable configuration. There are reports, the reporter said with the careful phrasing of someone not entirely certain how much they're going to get, that you triggered a Protocol 0 review this week against an airline. The system works as designed, Elijah said. Can you say more about the circumstances? The circumstances are described in the Behavioral Risk Module documentation, Elijah said, which is publicly available on the Veritas website. It seems personal, the reporter said. It was professional, Elijah said. He picked up his water bottle. Discrimination is a financial risk. The algorithm agrees. That's the whole point. The reporter asked 2 more questions. Elijah answered the ones that were about the system and declined the ones that were about himself, which was his consistent position on the distinction between the work and the person doing it, a position he had held since his first media inquiry at 22 and did not anticipate changing. He declined the dinner invitation that evening, a group of senior institutional representatives who wanted to discuss Veritas licensing, which was a conversation worth having, but not that evening when what he wanted was to be outside in the cold November air of a city that had no particular claims on him and that he could move through as a stranger. He walked along the limit for an hour, past the old guild houses and the lit bridges, and the particular quality of European winter nightfall that makes cities look like something from a story. He bought coffee from a street cart near the Grossmünster, thick and strong, warming the cup in both hands, and stood on the bridge for a while, watching the river run dark and fast below him. His phone showed a notification from the foundation administrator, donation received. $11,200,000. R. Harlan. Below it, arriving 4 hours later, donation received. $700,000. B. Whitmore. He looked at the total. He swiped the notification away. He looked at the river. He finished his coffee. He walked back to the hotel. He was back in Atlanta on a Thursday morning, 5 weeks after the incident, for a meeting with a consortium bank that was considering expanding its Veritas licensing to include a new regional network. A meeting he had been scheduled for long before any of the events of that Tuesday, and which was proceeding on its original terms, which was how Elijah preferred things to proceed on their merits on their schedule, without the specific additional weight that recent events had attached to his name in certain rooms. He was at Hartsfield-Jackson by 7:30, which was early for his meeting, but later than his usual, and the airport was in its morning configuration, the particular organized rush of the first wave of business travelers and the slightly more leisurely movement of the leisure passengers who had booked early flights without fully understanding what early felt like at 7 a.m. on the departure end. He moved through the priority lane without issue. The gate agent, a different agent from 6 weeks ago, someone he didn't recognize, scanned his pass and said, "Good morning," with the routine friendliness of someone doing their job in the absence of any complication, which was all Elijah had ever asked for, and which he received now, and received at that. He found his seat, a window seat, not 1A, a different row and a different flight, the morning light coming through at a slightly different angle than he'd have preferred, but workable and settled in with his tablet, the Singapore markets open and requiring a different kind of attention than they'd required a month ago. The man who sat down in the adjacent seat was in his mid-40s suit and laptop bag, the self-contained efficiency of a frequent business traveler, a man accustomed to his own routine in airline seats and disinclined to disrupt his neighbors. He settled in without comment. He opened his own laptop. The normal quiet of two people doing their work in close proximity settled over the row. Then the man's phone buzzed with a news alert. He looked at it, a story about the formal launch of the Skybridge Passenger Dignity Initiative Audit Framework, with a byline photograph of the new interim CEO Gloria Osei at the Atlanta headquarters. Below the photo, a smaller image, the one from the conference coverage that had attached itself to Elijah's name in recent weeks. A conference shot from a side angle, slightly blurred, not particularly flattering. The man looked at his phone. He looked at the blurred conference photo. He looked with the particular double-take of someone whose pattern recognition system has just fired at the man in the window seat beside him. Elijah was reading. He did not look up. The man looked back at his phone. He looked back at the window seat. He sat with the knowledge of who he was sitting next to the specific private situation of a man who has assembled a fact that he could act on or not act on and is deciding in real time what kind of person he intends to be about it. He decided. He opened his laptop and went back to his work. The plane pushed back from the gate. The morning light came through the window at the angle Elijah had calculated, and found sufficient, and was now using the flat Thursday morning light of a southern city in winter, that commits to neither warmth nor cold, but is for his purposes exactly what it needs to be. He opened his notebook to the page with the 3 items he'd written the previous Tuesday in the Terminal F lounge. He read them. He made a small notation beside the 3rd one. Foundation disbursement schedule confirmed with administrator. He closed the notebook. The plane lifted. 6 months after the Skybridge incident, Veritas was adopted as a mandatory compliance layer by 2 additional banking consortiums, a development that was reported in the financial press as a natural expansion of a leading-edge risk detection platform, which it was, and as an industry response to the Skybridge case study, which it also was, and which Elijah would have preferred not to have discussed in those terms, but had accepted could not be fully prevented. The Okafor Amendment, the formal name that the banking industry had given to the architect clause language, a name Elijah found slightly presumptuous, but had declined to contest because contesting it would have required more public engagement than the contest was worth, had been incorporated into the operating contracts of 11 major financial institutions. The language was specific entities whose operational patterns demonstrated consistent, differential treatment of customers based on protected characteristics were subject to Protocol 0 review. The clause had not been triggered again. 3 companies had received preliminary behavioral risk flags, and all 3 had self-corrected before the flag escalated to a review, which was exactly the outcome the clause was designed to produce. Deterrence was the whole point. He was in his Atlanta apartment on a Wednesday morning, finishing cereal at the kitchen counter, the November light coming through his window at the angle it came through at this time of year, lower than summer, more direct, the kind of light that doesn't soften anything but makes the edges of things very clear. He was reading a paper on distributed ledger applications that he'd been meaning to get to for 3 weeks and kept being interrupted from, and he was approximately 40 pages in when his phone rang. An unknown number, area code 410, which was Baltimore. He answered. The voice on the other end was young, early 20s, the specific acoustic quality of someone calling from a dorm room or a shared apartment, slightly nervous in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say and is now discovering that the rehearsal doesn't quite fit the actual moment. Hi, is this? I'm looking for the number for the Okafor Foundation. I got this number from the coordinator, she said. This is the right number, Elijah said. A pause. Oh, okay. My name is Devin. I'm a second year at University of Maryland studying computer science. I received a scholarship through the foundation this semester, and the coordinator gave me a number to call if I wanted to. She said I could call and say thank you. I don't know who I'm talking to, but she said someone would answer. I'm listening, Elijah said. Another pause. The pause of someone reorganizing what they were going to say. I just wanted to say I'm the first person in my family to go to college. My mom's been working 2 jobs since I was 12, and I had a partial scholarship, but there was a gap, and I didn't know if I was going to be able to come back this semester. And then the foundation came through and He stopped. I don't know who donated or why, but I'm going to make it count. I just wanted someone to know that. Elijah was quiet for a moment. He thought about the library in Baltimore, the 3rd-floor reading room, the books he borrowed and returned the cold morning light through the tall windows. He thought about a loan officer and a family and a folder of paperwork. He thought about a morning in Terminal F and a battered leather bag, and a man in a navy blazer who had never in his life been told to wait, and had chosen on that particular Tuesday to make someone else do the waiting. He thought about Cora at the kitchen table with her circuit board building the first part of something. I know you will, he said. Good luck with your semester, Devin. He ended the call. He finished his cereal. He rinsed his bowl. He picked up his bag from beside the door, the same battered leather messenger, the same electrical tape on the strap, the same scuffed buckle, and he paused at the door, the way he always paused at the door. The 1-second pause that had become the shape of his mornings, and he looked back at the apartment, the good light on the counter, the window, the small and sufficient space of a life organized around what actually matters. He took a breath. He stepped outside. The Atlanta morning was cold and bright, and going in several directions at once the way mornings do when the city is waking up and hasn't yet decided what kind of day it intends to be. He walked into it. If this story moved, you hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We tell new stories of justice, dignity, and the quiet power of people who refuse to be made small every single week. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the most powerful person in the room is not always the one making the most noise. Sometimes it's the one who already has the keys.